Inside a mountain hotel, two people were discussing a rumor about a mercenary who was said to be crazy. One of them asked who this person was, as the description referred to a mercenary who had no regard for life or money. This man fought without a clear goal, without a specific purpose, and most suspiciously, he always muttered one phrase after every fight: "I survived again." When facing off against Imperial forces, he seems to be fighting a personal war, not for money but out of spite. One of them is struck by the idea of a mercenary who doesn't even want money or survival, commenting that it's really strange, and then wondering again who this man is, recalling a rumor that he was once a prince from a kingdom that collapsed. In another scene, in a snowy land, this mercenary appeared, and a soldier was watching. Rumor has it that this mercenary seeks his own death in every battle. The soldier took off his helmet and muttered the mercenary's name: Yuri Priol, third prince of the kingdom of Priol. You don't deserve the comfort of death, you who destroyed your kingdom with your own hands. In a flashback to 10 years ago, inside a bustling casino, Yuri was a young man of 18, laughing and playing like the world was his own. He seemed pleased with himself as he announced that he had gotten lucky that night. Next to him sat Hernando, the royal magician, who commented in amazement on his repeated wins and asked what the secret was. Yuri replied that it was just luck, emphasizing that he had no secrets or superhuman skills. He then suggested to Hernando to play another round, this time doubling the bets. But Hernando reminded him that it was time to leave as they had an important appointment on their schedule. Before they left, they were intercepted by a number of angry men, who accused Yuri of cheating. Yuri was furious and wondered what they thought they were doing and who they thought he was. They responded, sarcastically, emphasizing that even nobles wouldn't stop them from killing him. Not only that, but they insulted him and his family with insulting words, saying that the children of kings think the whole world belongs to them. Yuri lost his cool, violently overturned the table to everyone's amazement, and stepped over the glass on the floor. He looked at them with disdain and then coldly announced his name: Yuri Broil, third prince of the kingdom of Broil. He stepped closer to them and added, "On this day, I will give you a new birth with my own hands." With a smile on his face, the men began to back away in fear, and one of them screamed in terror. Later, we see Yuri talking to a girl as if to justify his actions. Princess Katerina Granzhain. Yuri told her that he was late for an emergency meeting called by his father, and explained that the reason was not convincing to her, as she had also ventured here to avoid everyone's attention. Yuri asked her to overlook the incident for once, explaining that he was going through a difficult time, that it wasn't easy for him, and that he hoped she would understand his situation for now. Since his father is currently away, he said that he has to be careful with every action. He told Katrina that he shouldn't even say that to her. She responded with a sarcastic tone and asked him if she had become a stranger to him. "If you don't trust me, why did you give me this necklace?" She threw the blue necklace on the floor and turned to leave, asking him not to speak to her again unless she started the conversation. Yuri called out to her, asking her to wait a moment, but she continued walking without replying. Yuri stood with the necklace, unable to make a decision, while an unknown person watched him from afar with a sly smile. The next day, that spy was on the move, bringing relations between the kingdom of Priol and the empire to the brink of collapse. Minor provocations on the part of the empire turned into a conflict, and then an all-out war. When news of the invasion arrived, Yuri was shocked. Imperial forces invaded the kingdom, fires broke out everywhere, and eventually, the war raged on for years, the sacrifices mounting with no end in sight. In one battle, a soldier named Joshua was seriously wounded. The soldiers tried to keep Yuri away from the battlefield, but he asked for reinforcements led by Fiore Broil, and was told that Fiore had not come. The absence of Fiore, the most powerful man on the continent, tipped the scales of battle in the Empire's favor. At first, Yuri refused to believe what was happening, but as the defeats continued, he began to doubt it, and as time passed and losses mounted, Yuri began to connect the dots. His father's absence, the sudden attack, and Katerina's disappearance. He began to feel that Katerina had betrayed him. He sent a final message to her via a messenger pigeon, and received a reply a while later. When he opened the letter, he found only one phrase: "I'm sorry." His emotions sank deeper into the abyss of despair. The war continued, and he fought for his life, cutting off everyone in his path. Exhausted and trapped, he was surrounded on all sides by Imperial knights. Yuri had already accepted and prepared for his end, but before he was killed, a brave knight blocked the sword's blow with his own body, protecting him. That was Roland, who performed his last service to give the prince a chance to escape. Although Yuri wanted to save him, he had to suppress his emotions, listen to the soldiers, and flee for the future of his kingdom. A few days passed, and the Empire was still chasing him. Yuri found a shelter to hide in, but he knew he wouldn't last long. At this point, he was completely despondent and had fully accepted that his father was gone too. At that moment, he he was found by one of the Empire's knights, and instead of ending what was left of the royal line, Yuri begged the man to let him live for the sake of his family. But the knight, instead of killing him, said that the Empire would pay for its actions, and told the prince to flee because others were coming. Yuri fled again, betting his life on the chance of revenge one day. But in the end, everyone died, and he knew deep down that nothing would change, and that one day someone would come to take his life too. We return to his encounter with the soldier who asked him, "Have you been pushing yourself into dangerous battlefields to rest in the end? Is self-harm the best you can come up with?" It seemed that he would remain selfish until the end, and then told him that he didn't deserve the comfort of death at all. Yuri realized that this information could only be known by those who were close to him, but everyone else had died. It was then that he began to blame him for everyone's death. The knight revealed his face to reveal a distorted, zombie-like face. It was Roland, the knight who had once protected him, and yet now he had come back to take his life. He said, had tarnished the honor of his family, who had served under the royal banner for years, and his dignity and faith had been shattered in a single moment. Roland lunged at Yuri angrily, calling him the one who should have died. Yuri was surprised that Roland was still alive, but he returned as a vengeful specter. He viciously attacked him, and our hero realized that he was paying for his unforgivable sins. At that moment, Yuri thought he would find comfort in death, but guilt haunted him even in his final hour. In the depths of his grief and reflection, he remembered his father's words. The Priol dynasty never abandons its honor, even at the cost of death. Suddenly, Yuri woke up from his nightmare in a panic. Someone was shouting his name. Yuri Broyle. The voice kept repeating in his mind until he was fully awake. Yuri opened his eyes with great difficulty to find a well-built man with noble features, who asked him with concern if he was okay because he hadn't opened his eyes in 3 days. Yuri wondered aloud if the man standing in front of him was really his father, whom he thought was dead. Inwardly, Yuri shuddered at the thought that this was indeed hell, and that his father was also dead. But his father responded calmly and sarcastically, asking if Yuri really thought he had ended up in hell. Yuri smiled bitterly and muttered that his father, who always talked about honor, seemed to have lived an eventful life. At the end of their conversation, his father got angry at his sarcastic comment and hit him on the head, angry at his meaningless words. Yuri began to scold his father, wondering why he didn't give up his bad habits even in hell, and asked him to repent while he still had the chance. While they were talking, Yuri noticed a green leaf sneaking through the window. Yuri felt something unfamiliar in the quiet, though he could not accurately describe the sensation. From the window of his room, he saw the maids moving around the mansion's courtyard, and everything seemed normal, making him wonder if he was overthinking it. However, he noticed the absence of sinners, fires, and any demons to torment him. He asked himself anxiously, where exactly am I? Suddenly, a worried voice brought him back to reality. Are you awake? His father was standing next to him, along with 2 other people, whose faces showed signs of great concern. His vision began to fade again, and it was clear that Yuri was about to lose consciousness again, and so he plunged into a coma or deep sleep. After he realized what was happening, he wondered at first if it was just a dream, or if his whole life was passing before his eyes in an instant. He tried to wake up or even change things, but he couldn't. The world didn't end as he thought. On the contrary, the memories he had forgotten started coming back to him, repeating in the same way as before, making him realize that he had to accept this fact. At that moment, Yuri acquiesced to the idea that he had indeed returned to the past, to the spring of his 13th year. Fate had given him a second chance. The next morning, the servants opened the curtains, calling for Yuri to wake up, indicating that it was time for sword training. Yuri jumped out of bed energetically, demanding his clothes immediately, before remembering that he first needed to wash his face. The maid gently calmed him down and asked him to slow down, then promised that she would help him wash his face. She asked him to sit down, and at that moment, a very painful memory swept over Yuri. He had seen this maid die before in tragic circumstances. He felt deep sadness and regret. Yuri was silent for a moment, then called out to her, "Aina." She answered, "Yes, your highness." Suddenly, he asked her to slap his face 3 times, hard. Aina was confused by this strange request and asked nervously, "Are you asking me to commit treason?" He confidently replied jokingly, "It's not treason if it's done under the direct order of the prince." He then assured her that he was completely serious in his request, adding confidently, "I always keep my promises." The day began quite normally. The atmosphere was pleasant and peaceful, and the weather was bright and calm outside the room. Later, at the training ground, Yuri felt a sharp pain from the 3 slaps Aina gave him. He was surprised by the intensity of her power, which he didn't remember before. As he silently watched a group of people pass by, He was disappointed that no one offered to put something on his bruise, and no one even asked him what had happened. When the training session with his teacher Bernard began, Yuri noticed that even Bernard showed no interest in his obvious injury, as if it didn't concern him at all. During the sparring session, Yuri's frustration grew as Bernard neglected to correct his fighting stances or give him any directions, and continued to spar in silence. As they exchanged blows, Yuri wondered when Bernard stopped teaching in his traditional style and settled for a silent duel. He remembered when Bernard once said to his father in a sad tone, "Yuri has a great innate talent for swordsmanship, and it's a pity he doesn't utilize it well. If he were more diligent, he would be a great boon to the entire kingdom of Priol." Those words were the spark that ignited his rebellion, and from then on, he became lazy and rebellious, prompting Bernard to stop teaching him seriously, only dueling him after realizing that Yuri had become too difficult to handle. Yuri felt a deep frustration as he recalled his teacher's words, realizing that they had not motivated him as intended, but only made him more careless and lazy. In the middle of class, Yuri suddenly called Bernard's name and decided it was time to change things up. He told him firmly, "From now on, I want to learn properly. I don't want any leniency or embellishment of the truth. As Yuri Broyle, I will be completely serious." Bernard was a little surprised by this sudden change, but he accepted it and said, "I don't know what has changed in you, but since you are serious, from now on, training will be very serious." Bernard immediately got ready, grabbed his wooden sword and showed his determination to start real, rigorous training. He told Yuri that it was time to start in earnest. Bernard attacked vigorously, and Yuri desperately tried to ask him to slow down, but to no avail. Bernard was determined this time. He lunged at him with all his might, and Yuri had to defend himself in earnest. He held his ground, trying to stabilize his posture and take a proper defensive stance in the face of the successive attacks. Bernard continued to attack with precision and power, showing off his high skills, leaving Yuri stunned and amazed. He was so shocked by the intensity of the training. He realized that this was the true level of Bernard's teaching. By the end of the class, Yuri collapsed on the floor, exhausted, but satisfied that he had finally experienced the meaning of serious training under the guidance of his teacher. He thought that his skills would improve rapidly from now on. He raised his hand to the sky, hoping for an imminent improvement, believing that his efforts would not be in vain. At that moment, Bernard stood silently watching him, wondering to himself when the young prince had improved so much. Suddenly, Aina appeared in a hurry, shouting an urgent call to Yuri, asking him to come immediately because the king was looking for him. Yuri was astonished, wondering why the king had summoned him so quickly. Aina was quick to explain that Count Johannes and his son had arrived at the palace, causing Yuri to freeze in shock. Yuri remembered that Count Johannes' son was Joth Parkvar, the one who betrayed the kingdom in his previous life and was the reason for its downfall. He remembered Joth's traitorous face vividly, which filled him with burning rage. Yuri called out to Aina in a firm and commanding voice, to which she responded anxiously. Serious and angry at the same time, he urgently asked her about Joth's current whereabouts. Later, the royal family gathered with Count Johannes and his son for a formal banquet, during which Yuri appeared seated across from the guests. Attendees noticed a significant change in Yuri, and began to wonder what had caused the sudden transformation, especially Count Johannes, who noticed Yuri's apparent physical improvement. The king laughed and said that Yuri might have eaten something special that made him feel better, prompting Count Johannes to jokingly ask for some of that special something for his son as well. The king then jokingly added that the count's son was very smart. The count smiled and replied that he still lacked a lot. Joth Parkvar turned toward the second prince with obvious admiration, but suddenly, Joth received a sharp look from Yuri and froze in place, shocked by the intensity of the third prince's gaze. The second prince leaned over to Yuri and whispered to him curiously, wondering if something had happened between him and Joth. "Joth stabbed me in the back one day," Yuri replied seriously. The second prince was surprised by the direct answer, and Yuri assured him again that he could never forgive someone who had betrayed him. The second prince smiled wryly and joked, "And you're just going to let it go?" Yuri remained silent, anger rising inside him as he watched Joth's prideful behavior. Joth, on the other hand, began to look annoyed, although he didn't know why, but his features were questioning Yuri's motives and his provocative behavior towards him. At that moment, Yuri decided to curb his unruly behavior. He was fully aware that in this new life, he could not allow a repeat of what had happened in the past. Yuri wondered if Joth's betrayal in the past had started with envy and resentment from this very early stage. Outside, Yuri tossed a wooden sword to Joth and sarcastically asked him if he was really as skilled with a sword as the rumors said. Joth hesitated and replied that he knew little about swordsmanship, then asked what prompted the sudden question. Yuri replied that the kingdom had no need for such narrow-minded knights. Joth nervously replied that he had not yet become a knight, but Yuri firmly reminded him that he was supposed to become a knight to serve the kingdom in the future. Joth replied, yes, that's right. Suddenly, without any preamble, Yuri challenged him to a duel and lunged at him, screaming. Joth was surprised and screamed in confusion, accusing Yuri of cowardice for attacking him out of the blue. But Yuri continued to attack mercilessly, displaying skills that Joth had never expected, and delivered a powerful blow. Joth began screaming for Yuri to stop, begging him to respect the honor of chivalry. But Yuri ignored his words and deliberately dropped his sword, confusing Joth. Without hesitation, Yuri lunged at him and delivered a powerful kick that sent Joth flying through the air before hitting the ground hard. Joth screamed in pain as Yuri stood in front of him with a stern look, remembering how Joth in his past life had betrayed the kingdom and his father by selling his father's reputation to the empire in exchange for information. Your father was a great lord and a respected knight. Why did he have this status? Joth looked confused by the question, while Yuri stared at him, waiting for a clear answer. Joth remained completely bewildered, and Yuri asked him again sarcastically if the question was that difficult. Yuri thought to himself that Joth might not want to repeat his past life, but this time he decided to force him to face the truth, and asked him again why his father had achieved the status he had. Joth replied that he didn't quite understand the meaning of the question. Yuri made a decision that he would not allow any knight in the kingdom of Brielle, including himself, to misunderstand the meaning of his position or responsibilities. Yuri's tone of voice changed slightly and told him seriously that he needed to see the truth clearly. He then reached out to shake his hand and asked him to think carefully about his words. After this short conversation, Joth left as Yuri watched him walk away. The second prince approached Yuri and asked him curiously, "Are you really good at fighting?" Yuri responded with a question, "Did you think I was going to lose?" The second prince answered, sarcastically and clearly, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I did." Yuri was surprised and asked in amazement, "Is that really what you think of me?" The second prince laughed and replied that Yuri had always been the biggest troublemaker and gambler in the kingdom. So, what did he think? Yuri then declared that he would never be the same again. He asked his older brother to stop causing trouble as well. The second prince looked at him in disbelief, then glanced at Yuri, who was smiling quietly, wondering to himself, has Yuri completely lost his mind, or is he really starting to change? In the evening, after a long and arduous practice, Yuri collapsed on the ground in exhaustion and shouted loudly that the practice was finally over. Bernard stepped forward, praising him for his incredible effort, and then asked him if he was ready to learn mana. To Yuri's surprise, he excitedly asked if Bernard would teach him his fighting style, but Bernard replied in the negative, explaining that his style was not considered strong enough for a prince like him. Bernard explained that it would be better for Yuri to learn Brillian's style, which is a powerful and effective style of swordsmanship. Yuri then remembered that in his previous life, he had already mastered the Brillian style, reaching an advanced level as a mercenary, but he felt that in this new life, he needed something more. Yuri began to think about other options available to him. Bernard noticed his deep thoughtfulness and asked him curiously if he was considering a different style. Yuri asked Bernard to recommend a royal guard with exceptional innate talent who could teach him a new and different style. Bernard paused for a moment in contemplation, then remembered the name of someone he thought would be perfect for the job. Bernard said that if it was just a matter of innate talent, the best choice would undoubtedly be the guard named Gerard, who possesses a rare and exceptional talent. Yuri asked curiously about this Gerard kid, repeating the name in a low voice, trying to remember any previous situation with him. Yuri suddenly remembered that he had met Gerard during the war in his previous life, but his skills back then were ordinary. Still, he was amazed that he was able to survive all those battles despite his limited abilities, and he began to wonder why he had survived for so long. Yuri remembered Gerard in his previous life, kneeling on the battlefield, berating himself with deep regret that he hadn't invested his talent in training properly, and if he could go back in time, he would have trained to death. Yuri realized that both of them were helpless back then, with only rusty skills that were insufficient to face the horrors of war. Yuri woke up from those bitter memories and decided not to repeat those mistakes in this new life. So he made a quick decision. He has to visit Gerard tonight and save him from his laziness to get him back on track. The sky was clear at sunset and the atmosphere inside the mansion was calm. As Yuri walked towards the training ground, Rousseau turned toward the door in surprise when he sensed movement. Yuri entered, smiling and waving gently at Rousseau, causing the latter to wonder why the prince had come at such an hour. Yuri calmly replied that he had come to see how things were going at the training ground. Rousseau smiled and said they were doing their best, even if they weren't at the prince's level. Yuri watched the soldiers train with enthusiasm, and admitted to himself that everyone seemed unusually enthusiastic these days. Suddenly, he asked where Gerard was. Russo was surprised and then pointed to the far side of the arena where the new recruit was practicing. When Yuri saw Gerard training nonchalantly, he confirmed Bernard's words about his laziness and apathetic attitude. Yuri realized the importance of real training, as training should always push a person to go beyond their limits. But Gerard was doing just enough to do his duty, as if he was doing his job without any clear ambition. Yuri was disappointed and thought that Gerard's skills had clearly rusted and deteriorated as a result of neglect. He asked Mr. Russo to bring him a wooden sword, as he decided to have a training match himself. Mr. Russo asked him who exactly he intended to duel with. With a wry smile, Yuri pointed at Gerard and announced that he had chosen to duel the slacker. The two stood face to face on the training ground, with everyone watching to see what would happen in this unexpected showdown. Some of the soldiers started cheering for Gerard, telling him to give it his all and be vigilant. Yuri stood in front of him, confidently, and said loudly that he had heard Gerard was very talented, and asked him to show if he was a true knight. Gerard hesitated for a moment, but finally agreed to challenge the prince, nervously answering that he would. Yuri sprinted towards Gerard with tremendous speed, attacking with all his might and warning him not to disappoint him. Gerard was shocked by the power of Yuri's sudden attack, and his facial expression was enough to show his astonishment at the prince's strength. The two began to exchange powerful blows with surprising speed, each blow slamming into the other and sending sparks flying. The soldiers watching noticed that Gerard's movements were clean and precise, causing them to cheer even louder. Gerard began to realize that Prince Yuri was fighting very efficiently, but he felt something strange and unsettling in this confrontation. The two continued to exchange focused and powerful strikes, and Gerard began to notice an unnatural rhythm in Yuri's fighting style. Finally, he noticed that the intervals between his blows were too evenly spaced, which made him feel uncomfortable. It was at that very moment that he realized that Yuri was completely in control of the pace of the fight. Yuri felt a quiet satisfaction and self-confidence that he was able to impose the rhythm of the fight on Gerard and make him follow his footsteps. He started to feel like the fight was turning into more of a theater show than a serious fight, and he decided to change the tempo. Gerard struggled to block Yuri's second strike, exhausted by the sudden speed and power of the prince's attack. The two continued to exchange powerful blows with incredible speed. Gerard's defense continued as he struggled to block the attacks, and he began to feel that Prince Yuri had completely overpowered him. Gerard was filled with anger, realizing that he had intended to take the fight lightly, but found himself having to put in a lot of effort. Gerard landed a big blow that hit Yuri, and Yuri realized that it wasn't going to be as easy as he thought it would be. He tried to resist Gerard's blows, but began to feel exhausted. Suddenly, Yuri remembered that in his previous life, he was an experienced and professional knight. Yuri launched one last move and Gerard was surprised by the attack. Yuri managed to land a powerful and unexpected blow that hit Gerard and forced him to retreat a little. Yuri smiled and said, "At least I got him for once." He lunged forward, raised his sword high, and shouted with joy, "This is exactly what I was hoping for." The watching soldiers were stunned that the prince had managed to hit Gerard, and they praised him with admiration. Yuri jokingly asked Gerard if he was deliberately going easy on him, to which Gerard replied with an annoyed look, emphasizing that he never goes easy. However, he felt something strange and disturbing. Even though he was on the attacking end, he felt like he was being cornered. Yuri unleashed another powerful attack that narrowly missed Gerard. Yuri smiled after dodging the blow and said, "That last one was so close." Gerard stood in the center of the arena, and at that moment, the soldiers around him started shouting in protest at his strange behavior, wondering if he had lost his mind. Gerard suddenly released his mana sword and aimed a blow at Yuri, but the latter narrowly dodged it. Gerard froze, suddenly realizing what he had done, as strands of Yuri's hair fell to the ground. He was about to deliver a fatal blow to the prince. Yuri stood stunned for a moment, realizing what had happened. Gerard cried out in horror and remorse, "Your Highness," as if he had just realized the gravity of what he had done. Russo shouted angrily, calling Gerard crazy, while the others rushed over to Yuri to check on him. Yuri calmly moved his hand despite his injury and said he was fine. The soldiers worriedly pointed out that the prince was injured, but Yuri merely tied a bandana around his head and insisted that Gerard pick up his sword again to continue the fight, emphasizing that there was no reason to stop now. It was becoming fun. Yuri lunged again with tremendous force and the two resumed their clash, their blows clashing with great force. At that moment, Gerard clearly sensed that the third prince was completely different from him. Yuri was ready to push himself to the limit, even beyond it. They stood face to face in the silence of the training ground. Gerard felt his blood boil, a feeling he had never experienced before. Although he had fought stronger opponents in the past, he had never felt the kind of excitement he felt now against Yuri. They exchanged powerful, decisive blows, and Yuri's eyes burned with a determination that Gerard had never seen before. Gerard wondered in amazement How could this young prince evoke such emotions in me? How did he awaken something so deep within me? Yuri continued his attack and landed a blow that forced Gerard to quickly retreat. Realizing that he could no longer be complacent, Gerard gripped his sword tightly and unleashed a strike using mana energy. It was so violent that it shattered the sword. Yuri's sword fell to the ground after being shattered, but Yuri smiled calmly and contentedly, realizing that he had finally achieved his goal, and said, "It's over." Gerard was panting as he stood up, obviously very traumatized by what had just happened. Yuri reached out to Gerard and quietly told him that he had learned something new from him today. A visibly confused Gerard shook his hand, acknowledging that Yuri had fought well. Inwardly, Gerard admired the fighting spirit and determination that Yuri had shown during the fight. He wondered to himself, how can someone so young possess such unwavering determination and fighting spirit? Suddenly, Gerard realized he was still holding Yuri's hand, and Yuri jokingly asked him what he was doing. Surprised, Gerard quickly apologized and quickly released his hand, looking very embarrassed. Some of the soldiers started joking that he had made the prince bleed, and asked him if he was just going to stand there and do nothing. Even more confused and apologetic, Gerard quickly left the scene. Yuri collapsed on the ground, panting heavily, letting out a long sigh. He opened his eyes in amazement as the soldiers cheered and praised, impressed by the remarkable skill he had shown during the duel. Suddenly, Russo noticed someone beside him, and he turned curiously to see who it was, and it turned out to be the commander of the royal guard. Russo asked him when he had arrived, and he replied that he had just arrived. Yuri was still lying on the ground, exhausted from the duel, while Commander Sanid stood silently watching, apparently deep in thought about something. A few days later, the atmosphere in the royal palace was calm and bright. Gerard appeared to be walking quietly alone in the palace garden, lost in thought. Suddenly, he heard someone's voice asking him if he had finished his shift. Third Prince, Yuri was leaning against a pillar, looking at him. Gerard called out to him in surprise. Yuri smiled and made a small sound, as if he was planning something. He told him that he needed an escort, explaining that there was somewhere they needed to go today. Gerard hesitated, saying he needed to practice first. Yuri suddenly stood up and jokingly turned to him, asking him if he had come to his senses after what happened in their last duel, reminding him that it was thanks to him, so he owed him now. Gerard, sensing the inevitability of the situation, sighed softly and replied, "I understand." Yuri watched Gerard and noticed that his body had gotten a little stronger, and although he knew it was still not enough, he found it convenient for the time being. Gerard began to follow Yuri, asking with great curiosity where they were going. Yuri quickly and cheerfully replied that he should just follow silently and not ask any more questions. Yuri paused for a moment and then turned to Gerard, who looked worried, and calmly told him that he was taking a third person with them, so there was no need to worry. When Gerard asked who that person was, Yuri didn't answer, but started calling out loudly. The royal magician Hernando turned toward the sound and went over to them to ask what the prince wanted. Yuri replied that he needed his help to go somewhere. Hernando hesitated, citing urgent matters, but Yuri offered to pay off his gambling debts, making him reconsider. Hernando asked him if he was serious, and Yuri assured him that he was and added that he would also pay back everything he had lost to him in the past. Hernando jokingly asked him if he had ever lied to him before, to which Yuri replied, "I've never seen you lie outside the gambling hall." Yuri laughed and emphasized that he doesn't lie, although he was a little embarrassed by what he had done in the past. After confirming his commitment to repay the debt, he asked Hernando to join them. The latter agreed and said he wanted a contract in this case, and pulled one out of his jacket. Yuri looked at it silently and wondered if the prince's words were worth twice as much, then asked Gerard to be the guarantor. Gerard was surprised, but eventually agreed after Yuri told him that he would be his witness. Hernando agreed, and the three of them set off to get ready to leave. Gerard asked where they were going, to which Yuri replied after a short silence that they were going to the Mountain of Swords. Yuri then announced that their goal was to enter the dungeon of the ancestors. The three descended through a secret passageway under the palace, and Gerard, surprised by the existence of this place, asked where they were going. Yuri replied that this path leads to Sword Mountain. Gerard asked if he meant the mountain associated with the legend of the family's first ancestor. Yuri confirmed it. According to his memories from his past life, after the imperial invasion of the kingdom of Priul, the empire captured the ancient dungeon inside the hollow of Sword Mountain, where there were relics of the Priul's first ancestor, and the legacy was said to have been extracted from there, causing quite a stir at the time. Yuri remembered that this passageway had never been used except as a means of survival, so no one was familiar with it. But in this life, unlike the previous one where he did nothing but run away, he decided to do everything in his power to see the truth about the legacy left by his first ancestor. The three finally reach a secret exit that leads into a dense forest. Yuri exited first, followed by Gerard and Hernando, and the latter pointed out that this path led directly to Sword Mountain. Hernando wondered how the prince had gotten the key to the secret door, especially since it was a rare artifact. Yuri remembered finding the key hidden in the corner of the reading room in his previous life, but he didn't know how to use it properly, and he paid a heavy price for his ignorance. Hernando replied that it was none of his business. As they walked, Hernando was suddenly cut by a sharp leaf. Yuri advised him to be more careful, explaining that the plants here have sharp leaves, and told him to stay close to avoid being injured again. Yuri continued to move forward cautiously as Hernando silently watched him from behind. Suddenly, Hernando turned to Gerard and called out to him. In a low voice, he asked if the prince had eaten anything strange recently, expressing surprise at his recent behavior. At that moment, Yuri ordered them to hurry. Hernando smiled and said that the prince's temperament had not changed after all. Yuri suddenly stopped and ordered them to stop. In front of them, they saw a group of giant wolves. Yuri explained that the wolves move in packs, and it is impossible to tell exactly how many there are. Hernando expressed surprise that Yuri knew this and asked him, "How do you know that?" Yuri replied, "I read it in a book." Hernando was shocked, but Yuri ignored his surprise and told them to move quietly and quickly because the wolves hadn't noticed them yet. Hernando moved but stepped on a tree branch and inadvertently broke it. He smiled awkwardly and said, "I apologize." Suddenly, a huge wolf jumped from behind towards Hernando. Gerard shouted a warning, then moved quickly with his sword and slashed the wolf's neck so hard that it fell to the ground. At that moment, Yuri was very impressed with Gerard's quick reaction and praised him for using mana because the wolf's fur is hard, but he also warned him that the danger was not over yet because he had attracted the attention of the pack leader. The big wolf raised its head and let out a loud howl to summon the rest of the wolves, and the three soon found themselves surrounded by a pack of angry wolves. Gerard coated his sword with a blue aura and shouted for Yuri and Hernando to stay close to him for protection. Two wolves suddenly jumped at Gerard, but he successfully blocked the attack. Hernando commented that his skill was worthy of a royal guard from the kingdom of Brielle, and Yuri agreed, emphasizing that Gerard was skilled, but also pointing out that Gerard's current skills, and while impressive, were still not enough to take on all the wolves. Gerard's fatigue began to show. Yuri turned to Hernando and said that the king had faith in him and his abilities, and he thought now was the time to prove that faith was justified. Hernando smiled and released his magical energy, asking Yuri if he wanted him to show his full strength in this battle. Gerard was surprised and asked him what he meant by this strange talk. At that moment, Hernando fired a fireball at the wolf, and just as Gerard's sword strike knocked it off target, the wolf took the blow, resulting in a violent explosion in the area. As the sunset approached, the three finally reached their destination. Yuri spoke up, saying that he didn't expect to encounter monsters other than wolves on the way. Gerard agreed, admitting that the battles had delayed them too much. The three of them stood at the top of Sword Mountain and Yuri announced that this was the peak they were after. But Gerard wondered if this was really the right place, as there were no obvious signs of ruins or anything of significance. Yuri was adamant that the location was correct and began looking around anxiously, emphasizing that he should be able to find something here. Moments later, he spotted a small object shimmering among the rocks and announced that he had found what they were looking for. He quickly walked over to the shimmering object and called Gerard to come and help him extract it. Gerard asked Hernando to help, but the latter hesitated, saying that for a magician, it would be an insult to injure his hand. Meanwhile, Yuri dug into the ground, bent down and pulled out a strange-looking sword that was embedded in the soil with a red gem in the center. He lifted the sword and examined it. Hernando commented that the magic looked brand new, as if it hadn't been buried for a long time. Yuri read a word engraved on the sword, "Guilty." He was intrigued and wondered what it meant. Gerard approached and asked if the sword was from the founder's legacy. Yuri replied that he didn't know. At that moment, the ground began to shake beneath them, but Yuri calmly said that he thought they would discover the truth very soon. The increased vibrations caused the ground to crack, and Yuri, Gerard, and Hernando fell into the abyss. Yuri woke up quickly and found himself on the ground above Gerard, surrounded by a light mana aura, making it clear that Gerard had used mana to protect his body during the fall. Yuri looked at him with admiration for the correctness of his quick action. Hernando approached them flying with magic, and was amazed at the depth of the place. Yuri said to him, "You preferred to protect yourself rather than worry about the safety of the prince." Hernando nervously justified the situation, saying that time did not allow him to intervene. Then Hernando noticed something in the darkness. His features changed, and he shouted a warning to Yuri. Yuri didn't take it seriously at first, thinking it was just an attempt to change the subject, but Hernando insisted that he had seen a ghost. Yuri looked back and saw an unknown figure emerge from the shadows, dressed in dark armor and surrounded by a heavy aura. He immediately realized that he was facing the Death Knight. Yuri rushed to wake Gerard and ordered him to wake up immediately, but Gerard answered lazily, so Yuri kicked him hard to wake him up. Gerard woke up in a panic and asked where they were, then screamed in terror when he saw the Horseman of Death. He quickly drew his sword and told Yuri to back off because he was going to take over the fight. The Death Knight stopped abruptly, but Yuri remained calm and said that a Death Knight is born from death, and once you become a Death Knight, you are stronger than when you were alive. But he added that he doesn't feel the Death Knight is a threat, and that he's likely just a guardian of the cell. Gerard was surprised by this assessment and asked why. Yuri replied that he trusted his instincts, and that the horseman was guarding the ancestor's cell and would not harm his bloodline. Yuri approached the knight and asked him if his words were true. The knight did not reply, but before they could continue speaking, he drew his sword and both Hernando and Gerard shouted, warning Yuri of a sudden danger. A huge sword fell in front of Yuri, creating a crack in the ground. Hernando was horrified and thought the sword had split Yuri's head in half so quickly, but Yuri was unharmed. He scolded him for his reaction, and Hernando immediately apologized and said he meant the hair. The knight finally spoke up and said that Yuri's arrogant behavior reminded him of someone. Yuri asked him who it was, to which he replied, Eric Broyle. Gerard and Hernando were surprised by the name, and Gerard explained that no one on the continent could forget Eric Broyle. Hernando added that he was the swordsman who conquered the continent with a single sword, the founder of the kingdom and its first king. Yuri silently pondered the information, and then asked the knight if he was the first to reach this place, to which he replied yes, adding that only someone with Broyle's blood could draw the sword. Yuri then understood that this was the legendary sword used by Eric Broyle, and the knight confirmed it, adding that he himself was the one holding it. The knight asked him, "Why are you looking at me like that?" Yuri replied, "I apologize, I feel like I touched something that doesn't belong to me." The knight's expression changed and he formally addressed Yuri as the heir of Broyle. Yuri looked at him nervously. The knight asked him to explain why he was in this place. Yuri remained quiet for a moment, then raised his hand and confidently announced that he was the third Prince Broyle, the rightful heir of Eric Broyle, and asked for his inheritance. The knight was silent for a moment as he looked at him. Then he turned and said that the time had come to fulfill the duty he had waited for so long, and announced his agreement to hand over what he had come for. The knight moved inside, followed by Yuri, while Gerard stayed behind, watching anxiously. Gerard was confused. He never imagined that he would find himself in the crypt of the first ancestor, talking to a dead knight. He wondered inwardly what was going on. It was so different from the royal guard he had imagined. Yuri suddenly called out to him and asked him, "What are you doing there?" Gerard snapped out of his reverie and recalled a situation on the battlefield where Yuri had yelled at him to keep fighting. He took a deep breath, told himself that he was seeing all sorts of strange things, and followed Yuri. The three of them entered a large chamber illuminated by huge blue crystals, with the dead knight sitting in the center waiting for them. They felt a strange energy surrounding the place and shielded their eyes from the brightness of the light. The knight's words echoed in Yuri's mind, "I hope you are worthy." Suddenly, Yuri found himself in a completely different place. He looked around and said, "What is this place?" He saw someone in the distance and thought it was the founder, but the creature that appeared was not human, but a strange creature that quickly attacked him. Yuri got into a fight with it and tried to block its attacks. During the battle, he noticed that the creature was using mana energy and said in amazement, "That's a mana sword." He watched how the creature was gathering energy in its core and then channeling it from within its body into its sword, and realized that it was showing him how to use mana. The creature asked him to step forward, and Yuri asked sarcastically, "Do you expect me to learn in the middle of a fight?" He laughed sarcastically and then thought of his grandfather who had chosen this strange method to train someone who had not yet mastered mana, and said that it would only work with someone who had lived a second life, and that person would be him. However, he began to focus on using the energy and placed his hand on the ground, trying to transfer it from the ground to his hand, and it worked. He then shouted to the creature to stay focused. Yuri said he didn't know exactly how, but he would try. The creature smiled, and Yuri replied, "Let's just do it." Yuri felt himself growing stronger, and remembered that the Empire would reveal its ambitions and attack the kingdom of Priol again. He decided that he would not repeat the mistakes of the past and would do what it took to become stronger and crush their ambitions. He began to focus his energy towards the sword and said, "So this is the art of Eric Broyle." He then quickly lunged forward and launched an attack, shouting, "I will absorb everything." In the next moment, the scene changed completely. Gerard woke up, disoriented, wondering if what he was seeing was actually a training ground. He touched his head and said, "This doesn't look like a dream." He then noticed someone else and shouted for them to appear. The man appeared, and when he approached, he turned out to be an exact replica of Gerard. Gerard asked if this was the Death Knight's test, and cautiously asked him, "What's your name? Are you also Gerard?" The man replied with a wry smile, "Don't try to challenge your destiny." The doppelganger began to taunt Gerard, reminding him that he had joined the royal guard in search of a comfortable life, and told him to stay away from the third prince, saying that resisting fate only brings misery and misfortune. Gerard sighed and thought that the previous version of himself might have given into this, but he quickly remembered Yuri and heard his voice in his mind saying, "Isn't this boring?" Then he said, "It's just a charade." He regained his enthusiasm and said to the clone, "You don't seem to understand anything. Maybe it's because you're just a fake. When the sword is drawn, there is no turning back. Clinging to the past doesn't work. The clone raised his sword and began to attack, executing quick and precise strikes that Gerard blocked. During the fight, he noticed that his opponent was relying solely on defense without any offensive risk, just like before. Realizing that this style no longer suited him, he attacked him with a powerful blow that forced him to retreat. Suddenly, a black aura appeared around his opponent and a huge dark entity emerged from his body. Gerard wondered if this was his true identity, but despite the horror he kept his composure and thought that Yuri must be facing a similar battle right now. He gathered his focus and whispered, "I hope you can get past this, Your Highness." Then he prepared for his next attack. Elsewhere, Yuri was sitting exhausted on the ground after taking a heavy blow. The strange creature approached him, raising his sword to continue the attack. But at the last moment, Yuri grabbed his sword despite his injury and responded with a powerful blow that knocked his opponent backwards. Yuri stood gasping for breath and then asked, "How much time has passed?" He recognized that the situation was dangerous, but thanks to his training, he had survived. He also realized that he was beginning to understand how to use mana and how to swing the sword, and his confidence was restored. He then noticed that his opponent was disappearing, so he asked, "Why is he disappearing?" The creature waved goodbye to him, and he knew that meant the end of the test. Before returning, he thanked it gratefully. Yuri regained consciousness and opened his eyes. He saw Gerard and Hernando beside him, and they were worried. Then he heard the Death Knight's voice from behind, saying, sarcastically, "Looks like it was a nice dream." Yuri asked, "What just happened?" The horseman replied, "This is a test designed by Eric, left for his bloodline heir, who will come here in the future." Yuri remembered that the Mountain of Swords had been destroyed in his previous life by the Empire, which is why none of his family had ever reached it. He asked, "Did Founder Eric use this mana technique?" The knight replied, "No." The Death Knight added that this was Eric's final legacy, created by incorporating his own knowledge of what he received from the East in his final years, and emphasized that Yuri was the first to inherit the technique. Yuri asked, "Why didn't Eric pass it down to the family directly?" The Death Knight explained that this cell only opens when the time is right, and that its opening would be a signal that the moment has come to use the power within. Yuri asked with interest, "And when is that time?" The knight replied calmly, "It is not for me to say, you will have to find out for yourself." After a moment of deep meditation, Yuri asked, "What is the name of this mana technique?" The Death Knight replied, "Eric called it Soul Cutter." After a moment of silence, the knight asked Yuri to get down on one knee, explaining that he was now going to pass on his ancestral will to him. Yuri knelt silently and respectfully, ready to receive this great legacy. The Death Knight placed his hand on Yuri's head and spoke in a deep tone, saying, "Never be afraid of your enemies." Yuri replied, "Yes." The knight added, "You must act according to what you believe in." Yuri replied, "Yes." He then asked him to fulfill his duty as a Priol until the end. Again, Yuri replied, "Yes." Finally, the Horseman of Death said, gripping Yuri's hair tightly, "Remember this well, the Priol family does not abandon its honor, even if the price is death," declaring that this is the Priol covenant. The Death Knight then began to disappear. The next morning, the maid Aina woke Yuri up by opening the curtains, telling him it was morning. Yuri sighed tiredly as he lay in his bed, feeling exhausted from the previous night's events. Ina gently asked him if he was tired because he had stayed up all night, and suggested that he could go back to sleep if he wanted to. Yuri slowly got up and stretched, answering tiredly, "I visited the Royal Palace archives last night. I was very busy." Ina asked him in surprise, "Why did you go there all of a sudden?" He answered her calmly, "I was looking for a certain record the night before." Yuri sat in the archive room, reading with intense concentration, and that's when he discovered an important piece of information in the historical records. The founder of the family, Eric Broyle, had a brother, a man who completely abandoned his honor and disappeared from history without even leaving his name. Yuri deduced that this mysterious man was the same Death Knight, and that he was most likely the original owner of the sword he received. Aina interrupted his thoughts, urging him to hurry up and change his clothes because the king had summoned him urgently. Confused, Yuri asked her why, but she replied that she didn't know, and that the king had requested his presence immediately after his meeting with the magician Hernando. Yuri felt a mixture of frustration and anxiety, realizing that Hernando must have told the king what had happened. Earlier, as Yuri was walking with Gerard, Hernando stopped and said that he would report to the king about what happened today. Yuri turned to him and asked if it was really necessary, to which he replied with a quiet smile, "I think it island." Yuri recalled this situation with some disdain, saying to himself, "So he told the king everything." Yuri stood before his father in the throne room and asked him if he had summoned him. He replied, certain that Hernando had told him everything that had happened, adding that Yuri had not only left the palace without permission, but had also gone to the founder's dungeon in the Sword Mountain. Yuri calmly replied that this was an unplanned event that happened out of the blue. The king asked him with interest if he had found the sword he was now holding in the dungeon as well, to which Yuri replied clearly, "Yes, I found it." The king approached Yuri and told him that he had heard from several people, from his own maid to Bernard and Sanid and now Hernando, that Yuri had changed a lot lately. He gently placed his hand on his head and asked, What caused this change? Yuri became very nervous and gripped the sword tightly without giving a direct answer, something his father did not fail to notice. The king looked at him seriously and asked, "Aren't you going to answer me?" Yuri took a step back and said it wasn't what it seemed, prompting the king to ask him again why he was backing off in such a strange way. Because he clenched his fist, and the king raised his hand and said, "I see." Then he decided to ask him. Yuri told his father that he had had a strange dream. The king was surprised and asked him for details. Yuri explained that in the dream he had committed a great sin. The king earnestly asked what the nature of this sin was, and Yuri replied that it was his failure to protect the kingdom of Priol to the end. Yuri explained that the dream was about a great war that destroyed the kingdom and took many lives. He tried to change the course of events but was unsuccessful, and in the end, he had to flee and died a humiliating death. He noted that the necklace his mother gave him was gone when he woke up. He told his father that he thought the dream was a warning from his mother. The king asked him why the kingdom had fallen in the dream. Yuri hesitated a bit. It's too early to mention the empire now, and moreover, at this point in time, there is still a high chance that the invasion of the empire won't happen because it is starting to change the events of the past. After these thoughts, he said that he didn't know exactly, but he saw an unknown army attacking the kingdom. The king was silent for a moment and then said that he didn't know if the dream was a nightmare or a warning, but he was relieved to see Yuri in a better state. However, Yuri wondered if he really was, and continued to feel the weight of memories and regret, assuring himself that he was desperately trying to correct his past mistakes. The king told him that they had to do something else and asked him to get his sword. They moved to the king's training hall. King Fiore Broil is a genius who has wielded a sword since he could walk, earning him the title of the greatest warrior on the continent, and etching his name in history with his incredible fighting prowess. Yuri added that there is a title called the 10 Strongest on the continent, and his father was the closest to the top. In other words, he was considered the greatest swordsman of all time. Yuri said it was the first time he had entered his father's training hall. The king replied that he had never thought one of his sons had any real talent for swordsmanship. Yuri calmly replied, "Do you think I'm talented?" The king smiled wryly, drew his sword and then asked, "What exactly is a swordsman's talent? Is it strength, speed, reflexes, or wisdom? If someone possesses all of those qualities, does that make them a great swordsman?" He answered himself, "No." Yuri was surprised by the response. The king explained that there is something more important than skills, a power that pushes a person beyond their limits, and added that this power goes beyond fear or a sense of duty. Suddenly, a terrifying energy began to emanate from the king, and Yuri was surprised and noticed that the energy had changed. The king then added, "It may be hard to describe, but it's like an inner calling." Yuri was surprised and hesitantly asked his father if this call was like fate, to which the king replied that it may or may not be, leaving the answer open. Yuri stood silently, holding his sword, and wondered to himself if this time his life was destined to have a different ending. As in his previous life, he was not destined to take the path of the sword. The king asked his son in a serious tone, "What do you believe in? Do you think you were made to carry a sword? When you face death one day, do you believe that you will still hold your sword?" The king asked his son in a serious tone. Yuri felt frightened and nervous and replied in a trembling voice, "I don't feel." But he didn't finish. He looked confused and worried, and backed away as he said, "Father." At that moment, he saw red eyes staring at him from the darkness, increasing his sense of danger. He started backing away, panting. He remembered a voice from his past, saying, "Run, Your Highness." Painful memories came back to him. He saw scenes of destruction and people screaming for help amidst the flames engulfing the kingdom. Soldiers fell one by one, and the fire was growing. Suddenly, Yuri shouted, "What's happening? Why is Priol burning?" He heard a voice say, "It's the third prince, he's still alive, the last of the Priol dynasty here." He saw imperial soldiers approaching him amidst the flames and said, "That's the imperial army." He realized then that he was back at the moment of the fall of the Priol kingdom. The scene in front of him was difficult, and he asked himself, "What's going on?" One of the imperial soldiers shouted, "Die," and attacked him. They began a direct confrontation, exchanging blows until Yuri managed to hit the soldier and knock him down. Briol's soldiers shouted for the prince to flee, emphasizing that they would fight to give him a chance. In the back, the battle continued and some soldiers were injured. Yuri felt lost and asked himself if what he was seeing was a dream, and wondered about the fate of the kingdom. Was the fall of Priol fate? He realized, in his heart, that he was unable to change anything and felt hopeless. He stood amidst the destruction and began to walk slowly, recalling a promise he had made. "I swore I would never fear my enemies." Remembering the words of the Death Knight, he regained his resolve and rushed forward with his sword charged with mana energy. He attacked the soldiers, hitting one of them with a direct hit, and continued to fight, taking down opponents one by one. He took a blow to the face and fell back, but regained his balance and continued fighting. He was exhausted, but managed to defeat his opponent. One of the enemy soldiers shouted that the prince was a dead man and threatened him with death, demanding that he surrender, as he was visibly exhausted. Despite his miserable condition, Yuri stood up and declared in a firm voice that the Priol family would not abandon its honor even in the face of death. He then rushed forward, shouting loudly as he repeated in his mind, "I must fulfill my duty to the end." Yuri woke up to find himself in a different place, still muttering the same words he had been repeating earlier. He heard a quiet voice asking him if he could hear it, then felt a hand touch his shoulder. When the voice called his name aloud, he regained consciousness and hesitantly responded, "My father." Then he turned around and said, "Where is the Black Army?" His father tried to calm him down and told him not to worry, explaining that what he had seen was not real, but an illusion. After he calmed down a bit, Yuri seemed confused by what had happened. He clutched his sword and wondered to himself what he had seen. His father stood in front of him for a moment without speaking, then quietly said that perhaps he was wrong. He then assured him that he would stick to the path of the sword. Yuri was surprised, then smiled and said that he too had made up his mind. He looked at his father silently and noticed the change in his face, and wondered if he looked like he was facing death. He tried to break the tension with a smile and said, "Don't worry, I'm a genius anyway." His father smiled slightly and raised his hand towards Yuri, who was surprised by the gesture. Our hero ate his share of the king's bogeyman. The next day, Bernard was standing near the training ground. He heard footsteps approaching and turned around to see Yuri. As soon as he saw him approaching, he noticed the red watermelon on our hero's head and jokingly asked him who did it this time. Yuri replied that it was his father. Bernard commented that the king was apparently strict, and added that it didn't mean he was going to go easy on him in today's training. Yuri sighed and emphasized that he knows that. Yuri then remembered that Bernard had stayed in Broyel because of his father, and asked him directly if his stay was conditional on a duel with the king. Bernard replied in the affirmative. Yuri then asked him if he would stay if he was asked not to fight the duel, but Bernard, looking puzzled, replied after a short silence, "Of course not. Absolutely not." Yuri didn't comment on how heartless the man was, and Bernard told him that he felt like he wanted him to stay, jokingly adding, "I might consider it if you give me something convincing, like the fencing style of the first ancestor Eric Broyle." Yuri was surprised by his request and asked Bernard if he was serious about wanting to learn the first ancestor's dueling style. Bernard calmly replied that the idea really intrigued him, but Yuri immediately apologized, explaining that he could not fulfill this request. He thought to himself that someone like Bernard, known as the Sword Demon, would naturally ask for such a thing, but he simply wasn't able to fulfill it. Bernard realized that Yuri had not yet fully mastered the technique and took that into account, but Yuri explained to him that it was not a matter of mastery, but that the technique was so closely related to his own mana that it would be useless to someone else. Bernard was surprised, as this was the first time he had heard of mana being used in this way, as it is usually only used to enhance sword techniques. Yuri replied that this was precisely why he couldn't teach the technique to him, because what he would learn would only be half of the technique, and not the most important part of it. Bernard paused for a moment to think and put his hand on his chin, then said after a short silence that it was fine. A relieved looking, Yuri asked if he was really serious, and Bernard replied that he would stay in Broyle as long as Yuri was willing to teach him the technique, even if it wasn't perfect. He was confident that he would benefit from it anyway. Yuri noticed Bernard's high level of self-confidence and jokingly commented that he should stay in Broyle as he had promised. Bernard agreed with a smile. Bernard then asked Yuri to go ahead and show him the technique right away. The two stood facing each other in a dueling stance and Yuri began to demonstrate the soul cutter technique with blue mana surrounding his body. But Bernard suddenly interrupted him, pointing out that he had left out something important. Yuri stopped and asked what he meant, and Bernard explained that he had been planning to stay in Broyle from the beginning. He chuckled and added that the king had asked him to stay for another 10 years. Yuri was annoyed by this silly trick and asked him why he hadn't told him from the beginning. Bernard said, "It doesn't matter now." He asked him to attack him, standing in front of him without any movement. Bernard smiled and signaled that he would attack first if he didn't, then raised his mana-wrapped sword, which enraged Yuri, who lunged at him, angrily asking why he was telling him this fact just now. Later in the day, Yuri was lying on his bed, lost in thought. He began to realize that the future was indeed changing, remembering the horrifying image of Priol falling, but a gut feeling told him that they were moving towards a different future this time. He realized that Bernard's decision to stay was a sign of the beginning of change even if he hadn't taken any action yet. Previously, he had felt that the responsibility of changing the future was a heavy burden, but now he was more confident that the change had already begun. He finally made up his mind to face the Empire at all costs, whispering to himself with determination that no matter what happens, this time he will crush the Empire and never fail. At that moment, Ina, the maid, entered the room and asked him to please not cause any trouble this time. Yuri suddenly sat up and asked her why she said that, to which she replied that she was sure he knew why, but he doesn't notice because he gets into trouble on a daily basis and doesn't even realize what she's talking about. She then told him that he had an important meeting the next morning. Yuri responded with confusion, wondering what kind of meeting it was. She explained that it was a meeting of the Senate, and that the king had asked her to make sure he attended this time. He looked a little uncomfortable, but she went on to explain that the meeting would take place in the morning and that most of the senators would be present, noting that some of them were known for their fiery temper and intimidating personalities. She sincerely asked him not to assault anyone during the discussion. Yuri laughed gently and held her hand, reassuring her that he was no longer acting that way. She nervously asked him if he was sure, and he assured her that he was. The next morning, the Senate met in a large, tense room. Suddenly, one of the members shouted angrily and slammed the table in disapproval. Yuri sat quietly, staring at the man, and thought that Ina was absolutely right to be worried about this meeting. The angry man was Duke Jugas Garnered, and he opened the meeting by openly rejecting the mana technique that Prince Yuri was learning. He pointed out that it is not officially recognized and is unworthy of the royal family. Yuri looked at the rest of the members, wondering what the motive behind this attack was, especially since the main purpose of the meeting was to discuss the affairs of the kingdom, and not to criticize the king's choices. As the moments passed, he began to understand that this meeting was nothing more than a way to challenge his father's authority, which made him realize why the king avoided attending such meetings. The duke continued his objection, explaining that it would be better for the prince to learn the traditional sword technique used in the kingdom of Briul rather than adopting a questionable technique. At this point, a member of the audience interrupted, pointing out that the technique the prince is training in is the legacy of the founding king himself, asking how it could be considered unrecognized. Garnard responded sarcastically, questioning the validity of this claim and demanding proof that the technology actually belonged to the founder. His comment drew the ire of some in the audience, who asked if he was questioning the prince's statements, but Garnard calmly responded by claiming that he was not questioning anyone, but only concerned for the prince's safety and looking for the facts. Yuri interjected with a quiet smile and commented that he didn't realize that Duke Gernard was so concerned about his own safety that he would devote an entire council meeting to discussing his mana technique. At that moment, Yuri remembered that in his previous life, Gernard had betrayed the kingdom after the fall of Prial and surrendered easily to the empire. He was angered by the memory, but hid his feelings. Gernard turned his question to the commander of the royal guard, Saland, asking for his opinion on the technology. The commander hesitated for a moment, and then replied that he could not make a final judgment at this time, explaining that each mana technique has strengths and weaknesses, and that its effectiveness varies depending on the user. Garnard seized on this statement as evidence of the technique's danger, asserting that it should be ruled out entirely. The green-haired man then intervened, explaining that the leader did not question the safety of the technique, but only pointed out that its results vary, depending on the person, which is normal. One of Gernard's loyalists ignored him and insisted on the duke's position, reiterating his concern for the prince's safety. The meeting became tense, and Yuri felt frustrated and angry, especially when he noticed that some of the attendees seemed to be leaning towards the duke's opinion. He realized it was bad, and thought to himself that, if he was still at the beginning of his soul-breaker training, he could change it, but now that it was part of his power core due to his training in the progenitor illusion, it was no longer possible, and he knew he couldn't explain all of this to the council. Suddenly, someone broke the silence, saying that the prince's words were convincing. A man calmly raised his hand and asked for permission to speak, then introduced himself as Calcio Arancha, and we learn that he is a free baron. The man asked if anyone had ever fought an orc before, but no one responded and the room fell silent. Garnard looked at him sharply and asked him about his identity and official position, to which the man replied with a calm smile, emphasizing that he was, as he said, just a free baron. Garnard became agitated and asked him what a free baron was doing in a Senate meeting, reminding him that the Senate is for certain people only. Arancha simply replied that he didn't want to attend either, but what could he do, and then explained that Count Sider had asked him to attend. Count Sider was the lord of the frontier, a man who had lived his life on the battlefield, and was not known for his participation in political events or noble gatherings, which made his involvement in this meeting all the more surprising. One of the attendees began to wonder aloud why the count had sent a representative, and Arancha replied that he was not obliged to provide an explanation, but having seen how some of the great nobles manipulate politics, he understood exactly why his lord had sent him to this meeting. He added that the type of mana style doesn't matter on the battlefield, Whether it's brawl style or lion imperial style, what matters in the end is the person using it. He then turned to Prince Yuri and asked him what he thought. Yuri expressed that he saw no reason why learning the technique left behind by his founding grandfather should be controversial, insisting that he would learn it whether the council agreed or not. Irancha did not hesitate to support his decision, emphasizing that if he wanted to follow the founder's will, no one else had the right to object. He then looked at the audience and mocked them with a scathing tone, arguing that those who speak this way have probably never held a sword in their lives. Irancha's words angered Lord Garnard, who considered them rude, but Irancha calmly responded by apologizing for his language, explaining that someone who fights orcs on the front lines every day must speak that way. He then bluntly asked how many had actually fought against the orcs, before adding another question. Does anyone really think those monsters care what kind of mana is used against them? Although the audience could not object to his logic, one of them expressed reservations about the prince's age, noting that he was still too young to make big decisions of this magnitude. If they're so afraid of the wrong decision, why don't they just scrap the mana system altogether and start over? Yuri interjected in a serious tone, asking them sharply if they realized how practically impossible that would be. Irancha commented that the prince was clearly determined not to back down, and turned to the nobles, asking if they intended to wrest the mana core from the prince by force. The idiot loyal to Garnard said no, so Irancha smiled and asked what all the fuss was about. He then turned to Yuri and asked him if he agreed with him, before criticizing the rest of the nobles for putting undue pressure on the prince. He didn't miss the opportunity to poke fun at the capital, which seems to have too much time on its hands to worry about trivial matters. By your logic, the border front has been quiet lately, despite all the money being spent on it, Garnard said. Irancha's face changed and he responded in a frightening tone, emphasizing that the front has never been quiet and that hundreds of soldiers are dying every day, noting that they apparently don't read the reports. He added that 4 men were killed the day he left the front, one of whom was his friend with whom he had had breakfast that morning. He continued in a low voice that the orcs don't know the meaning of rest because they only live for fighting and bloodshed. Irancha's words caused Yuri to sink into thought, contemplating the situation of the orcs, feeling that the threat may not be limited to the borders of Burial. An old border dispute with the Duchy of Klein came to mind, and he recalled how the orcs had attacked the lands between Priol and Klein, causing widespread destruction and heavy casualties. With growing concern, he asked if the behavior of the orcs had changed recently, and Irancha confirmed that they had become more violent and brutal. Yuri asked him again, this time about the situation in the Duchy of Klein. Yuri said that the duchy had stationed troops there, so what happened to them? He hesitantly replied that Klein's army had suddenly withdrawn from the border without explanation, leaving the border towns completely devastated. He explained that the inhabitants of those areas were either killed or became slaves, describing the situation in one word: appalling. Yuri began to believe that the synchronization of these events was no mere coincidence, and the possibilities of an internal conflict or even a larger conspiracy crept into his mind. The meeting took another turn when someone pointed out that the Duke's third son must have caused a new issue. Yuri frowned as he thought for a moment while a heavy silence fell over the room. Yuri decided to end the meeting, and although Lord Gernard tried to object, Yuri interrupted, explaining that there were more pressing matters than discussing his little mana techniques, emphasizing that the focus should be on the threat of war with the orcs and the Duchy of Klein, rather than creating drama over a teenage boy like him. Elsewhere, someone was secretly communicating through a magical crystal with an unknown figure. The person asked if the third prince had really changed as rumored, to which the man behind the crystal replied in the affirmative. The voice asked what Irancha thought of the prince, and Irancha confirmed that Yuri's gaze was sharp, clear, and indicative of consciousness. The person then instructed him to continue observing him, saying, "The prince seems worthy of attention." When Irancha asked if he should go deeper, the voice said to do so if necessary, then ended the conversation by saying it would contact him later, before the crystal's glow faded. Irancha looked out the window with a long sigh, telling himself that it seemed peaceful, but that soldiers were still dying every day at the border. As he contemplated the scene outside, his eyes fell on someone who caught his attention. He squinted again and his eyes widened in shock when he realized it was none other than Prince Yuri. Yuri was walking down a street in the capital at night, accompanied by another person. The latter told him that he had carried out the plan as he had requested, and they had successfully snuck out of the palace. Yuri saw nothing to worry about. Hernando laughed, explaining that he was used to sneaking out, sometimes 3 times a day when he was a rebellious teenager. Yuri pointed out that going out of the palace was no big deal, but Hernando felt that going out alone seemed like a picnic. But if he went with the prince, it turned into a rebellion. Hernando asked him curiously if he was going to do something rash, and Yuri replied that he wasn't, and if he was, he wouldn't do it in front of the prince. When Hernando asked where they were going, Yuri replied with a slight smile that they were headed to the largest illegal casino in the capital. Hernando was surprised and asked, "Didn't you just say you weren't going to do anything bad?" Yuri assures him that he won't, He just needs a ride because Hernando knows the place well, and emphasizes in a serious tone that everything he's doing right now is for the sake of the kingdom of Priel. When Yuri presented his plan, Hernando looked shocked as he wondered how much money he intended to take from them. He anxiously asked him if he was really serious, but after a moment of hesitation, he smiled enthusiastically and expressed his willingness to turn that casino upside down. Yuri remembered from his previous life that the people of Priel had produced some characters who had caused great upheaval in the kingdom. The first was a powerful moneylender who was the de facto leader of the underworld. The second was a powerful woman who founded the largest trade guild on the continent. And the third was a legendary assassin who decapitated the leader who dominated the underworld. In the previous life, the assassin replaced the moneylender and turned the streets into a land of terror, and the person she killed was named Goryo. Goryo greeted Yuri and Hernando, noting that their presence was an honor. Yuri asked him if he already knew him, which surprised Hernando, but Goryo replied with a smile that he knew them well, the royal magician and the third prince, and that the least he could do was to greet them himself. Yuri explained to him that he had made a smart move. He had not come for entertainment or gambling. Goryo showed interest and invited them to sit down and talk comfortably. They sat down and Hernando was nervous and asked Yuri not to gamble. Didn't you say you wouldn't do anything bad? But Yuri told him to shut up. Goryo was surprised, saying that he had heard that he hadn't come to gamble. So had he come to borrow money? Yuri replied without hesitation that he had come to borrow money to invest in a project. Goryo laughed lightly and asked him if he was planning to set up a private fund, and that by asking him for money instead of the bank, he was being ambitious. But Yuri interrupted him, saying, "Enough," he said, emphasizing that the details of his plan were none of his business. Goryo apologized and said he didn't mean to intrude, so Yuri came back and said it was fine, but he preferred to get straight to the point. Yuri explained his idea, saying that he wanted to buy large quantities of a rare spice called mogranza from the Eclipse Mountains, because he was sure that the demand for it would increase soon. So he asked him how much money he would give him. Hernando is shocked and asks what he means by this, while Goryo is skeptical but points out that mogranza is used in high-end perfumes and wonders if it's really worth the investment. Yuri reiterated that demand for mogranza would soon exceed supply. Hernando began to ponder the reasons and recalled the recent turmoil in the Duchy of Klein and the invasion by the orcs, but he wasn't entirely sure. Yet when he saw the confidence on Yuri's face, he hesitated to object. Goryo said that the third prince is not as foolish as the rumors say and seems to be hiding a lot. Goryo finally agreed to the loan offer, and Yuri asked him how much he could give him, not as a prince but as an investor. Moments later, Goryo asked for the agreement to be signed, and Yuri signed it without hesitation. After they walked out of the casino, Yuri took a look at the contract, while Hernando expressed his displeasure by saying that he didn't expect Yuri to borrow money from Goryo without telling him beforehand. Yuri replied that if he had told him the plan, the first thing he would have done would have been to inform the king. Hernando asked if they were now going to the Merchants Guild, to which Yuri replied that he intended to apply there. On their way, Yuri got lost in thought. Mogranza was already a sure win because the only alchemist capable of processing it was a close associate of Duke Eckline, and he was killed at the beginning of the Civil War. This meant that the spice would be without a substitute for a long time, which would result in it being sold at the prices he desired. Yuri suddenly stopped in front of an abandoned building and said, thinking that he couldn't delegate this task to anyone, then suddenly exclaimed with joy, "He's here." Hernando was surprised and yelled at him, wondering why he chose this old place, but Yuri ignored him as he knocked on the door and called out for someone named Ellen Wood. Hernando tried to stop him, but suddenly the door opened and a woman appeared, asking him who he was, then introducing herself as Elaine Wood. Yuri, immediately identifying himself, told her that he was the third prince, Yuri Broyle, and that he had come to offer her a job. Her surprise was evident on her face. In a moment of silence, Hernando shouted that he had lost his mind, but Yuri told him that he had started talking to him as if he was no longer a prince. Hernando's frustration was palpable as he pointed out that anyone in his position would have said the same thing, marveling at Yuri's thoughtfulness in buying spices from such a bankrupt store. However, Yuri was convinced that Ellen, who may currently appear to be a failed trader in a financial crisis, would later become something else. In his previous life, Ellen was the greatest merchant on the continent and the leader of the largest merchant guild whose name no one knew. Her personality was completely different from Goryo's, the one who smiled fake smiles and hid his intentions in devious ways whenever he felt threatened. Ellen took her commitments very seriously and never broke her promises to her partners. Yuri smiled wickedly as he said, in her previous life, she was a legend, but this time he will make her a myth. Hernando was tired of the conversation and asked if this was the end of his crazy plan, hoping it would be the last. Yuri raised his finger and announced that there was one more step, causing Hernando to scream like he had seen a ghost. Yuri started to move as Hernando followed him, anxiously asking him what he was up to now, but Yuri didn't answer and was lost in thought. Having borrowed from Goryo and taken advantage of the legendary trader, it was now time to find the person who would be the key to completing his plan. The two walked through a poor neighborhood, filled with darkness and silence. He passed a young man sitting in a dark corner, then saw a group of men fighting in an alleyway, yet Yuri continued on, looking for the person he had come for. Suddenly, he stopped, looked around and assured himself that this was the place. He soon found the person he was looking for. He approached a group of young men gathered around something and calmly greeted them and introduced himself. "I am Yuri, the third prince of the kingdom of Priel." One of them was visibly stunned and asked him if he was really a prince, to which Yuri assured him that he was. At that moment, Yuri remembered that the skilled assassin who killed Goryo in his previous life was named Asana, one of the few survivors of the Crimson Moon cult. Asana approached him cautiously and asked him again if he was indeed royalty, surprised to find him in such a place. He reassured her, explaining that he had not come to harm her but to help her, but she remained silent. Yuri then turned to Hernando and asked him to give him what he was carrying, and he handed him a sack with a trembling voice. At that moment, Yuri noticed a little girl clinging to Asana's arm. He wondered if this child was the reason behind all that Asana had done, and remembered that in his previous life, she had borrowed a large sum of money from Goryo to treat this girl, only to be ruined by the debt and turned into an assassin. He decided that he wouldn't let it happen again and would change the starting point of that unfortunate relationship. He hands the sack to Asana and tells her to use the mana for healing at the temple. Asana asked him what he wanted in return, and he calmly replied that he only wanted one thing, for her to remember his name. Then he left. As they were leaving, Hernando wondered why he was giving so much money to a beggar girl, to which Yuri replied that he considered it an investment for the future. Yuri continued walking, thinking that he had already started building relationships with people who would be instrumental in his future: Goryo, Ellen, and Asana. But there was one person left. He turned to Hernando and asked him who he had seen at the shrine of the first ancestor. The latter replied with a wry smile that he saw himself as a gambler. Surprised by the response, Yuri asked what he meant, and Hernando explained that he saw himself betting his life inside the Barsagas casino in the heart of the empire, which suited him perfectly. Yuri looked at him puzzled while Hernando continued to speak with a wry smile. Yuri turned away and said coldly, "Today, you have to be careful how you behave." The next morning, Hernando stood before the king. The king asked him if he had gone out with Prince Yuri the night before, to which Hernando replied in the affirmative. The king didn't linger long and asked him directly what had happened. Hernando began to calmly explain how the prince had convinced him to leave the palace and accompanied him to a casino, the largest in the capital. The king was surprised by what he heard and asked if the prince had actually gambled, and Hernando assured him that he had. He commented that he thought Yuri was not good at card games and that he had lost all the money he had borrowed from him. The king then wanted to know what happened next. Hernando replied that the prince went to Goryo to get some money from him, then went to a penniless merchant and handed it over. He then gave a large sum of money to an orphaned child. Hernando didn't say everything, only that they walked around the city a bit because the prince wanted to see how ordinary people live. The king asked him if Yuri had gone straight back to the palace afterward, to which he replied that he had, and added that that was all that happened. The king responded with just one word: "I see, I see." There was a short silence between them. After a moment, the king asked Hernando if he would attend the party, to which Hernando replied that he would. The king looked surprised because Hernando doesn't like parties, but the magician replied that people might change their minds and that he hadn't been to a dance in a long time. At the training ground, Yuri was practicing hard with Bernard. During practice, he suddenly stopped and made a joke that Bernard looked famous, as he noticed that some of the maids were watching. Bernard didn't understand what he meant at first, but Yuri advised him to attend the party, saying that there were people waiting for him, but Bernard replied seriously that the party didn't matter to him at all. The conversation soon turned to sword techniques. Bernard admitted that Yuri was right. The technique does not rely on a fixed stance but adapts to the situation. Yuri pointed out that it flows naturally, and Bernard said that he really can't learn it but will continue to watch and study it. At the same time, he praised Yuri's progress, especially in his use of mana, admitting that he was surprised at how quickly he had improved. Yuri still felt guilty, as he was trying to completely forget his old style, but he felt that things were going better than he expected. Bernard advised him not to push himself too hard and to practice slowly. Bernard then said he was worried about him. Yuri was surprised and asked why, and Bernard told him frankly that his improvement is very fast, and his achievements are great for his age, but his body is not fully developed yet, so he has to be careful. Yuri reassured him that he would be fine, and then asked to continue training. Bernard was surprised when Yuri asked to use real swords instead of wooden ones. Bernard agreed and took out his sword. Yuri proposed a strange wager. If he succeeded in injuring Bernard, Bernard would have to attend the party. But Bernard immediately refused. Bernard replied that he would win and that Yuri never keeps his promises. He is a person with no credibility. We'll see about that, he said. Then, he started using the mana on his sword and lunged forward, saying, I'm going to get you this time. He still couldn't hit Bernard. Days passed, and the day of the royal ball came. The carriages were moving in the direction of the ballroom. In one of the carriages sat the second prince of the empire, Georg Ivarna Grandstein, with Katerina by his side. He noticed that the princess had not taken her eyes off the window for some time. She was looking enthusiastically and cheerfully on her face. She expressed her longing for this kind of event, noting that it had been a long time since she had attended such a party. She added that she was looking forward to meeting someone special that night. Inside the palace where the party was hosted, Ina asked Yuri what he thought of the costume. He seemed hesitant and then said that he felt the decorations were overdone and too lavish, but Ina told him that she thought it was great, reminding him that he used to love this kind of thing in the past. She then informed him that she was done. Yuri looked at her silently, and suddenly, he called out to her and asked her to dance, which confused her. He tried to explain that he wanted to practice dancing but didn't have anyone else to practice with. This didn't dispel her hesitation, it only added to it. She anxiously asked him if it was necessary, and he asked her why she looked surprised. She said she wondered if he intended to step on her foot and drop her on purpose. He said no, and then calmly said that she just needed to follow him at a slow pace. Feeling nervous, Ina nodded in agreement. During the dance, she joked that he was making fun of her because she dances so well. Yuri asked her how many times she had danced and with whom, to which she jokingly replied that she was very popular, but had never danced with someone as short as him. He said the height difference wouldn't be an issue for long. Moments later, he told her that she had stepped on his foot. She laughed and apologized, admitting that she had made a mistake, but it happened again. Later, the royal party began to get lively. The hall was filled with nobles dancing to the music, while the king sat on his throne, sipping his drink and watching. Yuri stood with his brothers, watching attentively, and noticed that Count Sitter himself was not present, a rare occurrence. Last time, Baron Arantia had been sent in his stead. Suddenly, he spotted his older brother taking off his glasses and went to him to ask if his eyesight had deteriorated, noting that he had been wearing glasses a lot lately. His brother assured him that it was nothing to worry about. Royal trumpets sounded, announcing the arrival of an important guest. The second prince of the empire, Georg Ivarna Grandstein, entered and made his way towards the king. The two exchanged greetings, then the prince announced that he was accompanied by his younger sister. Moments later, Princess Katerina appeared. Yuri froze in shock, not expecting to see her at all, as she bowed before the king and gave the official salute. In that moment, Yuri remembered his past and his previous relationship with her, but he quickly pulled himself together, deciding not to make the same mistake again and deciding that he would never approach her again. She looked at them and smiled, while Yuri stood in the center of the hall, watching the crowd. Cedric was dancing with one of the guests, as he always does, in a gentle and respectful manner. Yuri heard one of the attendees comment that this is what is expected of a nobleman like him, which made him feel a little inadequate compared to Cedric. Later, Katerina approached, but suddenly a young man approached her and greeted her, asking for a dance. Yuri watched the scene from afar as he burned. He had promised himself to stay away from her, but he couldn't keep his feelings in check. Ina came up to him with a smile and asked if he wanted some cake. He quietly thanked her and told her he was fine, then asked her if she was tired. She replied with a bright smile that it was nothing compared to taking care of someone you know well, which made him realize that she meant him. He joked with her, "Enough chatter, bring me lots of cakes." Before she walked away, she told him that she would be there if he needed anything, and told him to take good care of himself. Yuri was still standing alone, trying to clear his head amidst all this, when he noticed someone approaching and raised his head to see who it was. It was the second prince, George. Yuri immediately remembered this face from his previous life when he was leading the imperial army on behalf of the emperor to conquer the kingdom of Priol. Although he tried to remain calm, he told himself not to show any hostility or tension at this delicate moment. George said, "So this is the famous third prince." He gave a slight smile and an eerie aura began to surround the place. Despite Yuri's nervousness, nothing showed on his face. Georg wondered how old he was, noting that he had turned 13 this year, then took a step back with an enigmatic smile, commenting that he had some talent, as one would expect from a Fiore's son. The insinuation was dangerous and infuriated Yuri, but he made sure to hide it. He knew that despite his young age, Georg was a powerful and intimidating person. He gripped his hand silently as one thought echoed in his mind. This prince is a loathsome bastard, both brother and sister are the same. In an unexpected moment, Ina accidentally bumped into Prince George, causing him to spill red wine all over his formal attire emblazoned with the emblem of the Empire. Ina screamed in panic and began to apologize while trembling, her voice stuttering with fear. It was a great insult to the Empire. George looked at her with a cold smile and then said that what happened was a matter of concern. He looked at her and drew his sword, declaring that the girl had made a grave mistake. He stood in front of her and coldly announced that the appropriate punishment for what she had done, according to the laws of the Empire, was death. A charged silence fell over the hall. Yuri realized that Georg was deliberately humiliating and provoking the kingdom, and his anger began to rise. Georg continued, explaining that decapitation would be sufficient to carry out the sentence, and smiled coldly again. The king interrupted him, saying that this party was being held in his honor, and if the prince wished to see blood, he should do so in his own country, not in his kingdom. George apologized to King Fiore, then began to hint that the relationship between the Empire and the Kingdom of Priol had always been based on mutual respect, but Fiore pointed out that he had shown no respect for that relationship. The prince then reminded him of the Gaetensha incident when the king himself executed a knight of the Empire and the emperor did not take any retaliatory action out of respect for him, adding that the current situation is similar. What they will do is to protect the dignity of the two countries, not to ignite conflicts. At this point, Yuri remembered that his father had actually killed that knight. The king put his hand on his head, realizing that the honor of the kingdom was at stake. While Georg confessed that he didn't want much blood to be spilled, he just wanted to end it quickly. It was clear that Yuri sensed a great danger to the kingdom. Georg was already on the move, his sword drawn and ready to kill. In that moment, Yuri felt that intervening now would be a direct challenge to the Empire, but he didn't hesitate. In his heart, he remembered the family vow that the kingdom of Priol does not forsake its honor and that he must protect its dignity at all costs, and he shouted out to the prince, declaring that Ina was his personal servant, and that the responsibility for her mistakes lay solely with him. The king suddenly remembered this fact. Yuri continued, emphasizing that he was also a prince and that this should be taken into account. Inwardly, he was saying that in his previous life he had been a criminal and that this second life was a chance to atone. He then suggested that the death penalty should be replaced by a combat trial. Georg laughed a little and asked him if his name was Yuri. Yuri replied, yes. George then asked him if he could call him by his name without nicknames, and he agreed. George then turned to the king and told him that the third prince's suggestion was reasonable and asked him if he agreed. After a brief moment of silence, the king replied, yes, to which a slight sigh escaped him. Georg announced that he would not personally take part in the fight out of respect for his status, and would choose the youngest knight of the Imperial Guard to fight Yuri since he is also young. Yuri thanked him for that. Georg replied that he would meet him later and left the hall. Yuri approached Ina, who was still kneeling on the floor, confused and worried. He reached out and asked her to get up. She was surprised by his behavior, and in a trembling voice, she tried to say words of concern. He calmly reassured her by putting his hand on her back and asking her to go and rest. She sadly told him that she couldn't rest while he was going through all this because of her, and he told her not to worry. After she left, Yuri started to walk out of the hall. As he walked, he bumped into Princess Katerina sitting alone. He stopped for a moment and stared at her silently, repeating her name in his mind, before he pushed the thoughts out of his mind and continued on his way. In another corner of the hall, Hernando was silently watching the party. As for Yuri, he continued to walk down a corridor in the palace, lost in his thoughts, until his older brother Cedric suddenly appeared in front of him. Yuri didn't see him, but Cedric said he wondered what was on his mind. Yuri stopped and turned to him and told him that he couldn't let Georg kill Ina. Cedric smiled and approached him, then put his hand on his head, emphasizing that Yuri is a kind-hearted person. Yuri felt a sense of relief creep into his heart and a slight smile crossed his face, and he said, "It's been a long time since I've felt this way." Cedric asked him if he needed help and said that fighting was no longer an option. He added that Georg might have said that to make himself look good, but the reality was that if he was a duelist of his age, even if there was an accident in the fight, no one would be blamed. Yuri interrupted him and said that he understands what he is worried about, and Cedric asked him to take care of it. But Yuri said that there is no need for help, explaining that he has to finish what he started on his own. Cedric gave Yuri a quiet smile and expressed his confidence in Yuri, then asked him to go and rest, assuring him that he would take charge of the rest of the party. Yuri thanked him and Cedric left. Yuri thought, if the kingdom hadn't fallen in the past, Cedric would have been a truly great king. At that moment, Yuri decided that he would do everything he could to see how Cedric's kingdom would turn out. and he vowed not to back down from his decision, no matter what challenges he faced, even if he had to kill anyone who stood in his way. The next morning, Yuri stood in the dueling arena, ready to face the opponent Prince George had chosen for him. The audience sat silently, watching the scene with their eyes fixed on the arena. Hernando said in amazement that the prince would be having his first real duel, and asked Commander Sanid what he thought of it. In the arena, the Imperial Knight was preparing to fight. Sanid noted that the mana around him was very stable and he had clearly mastered the art of swordsmanship even though he had not yet been formally knighted. Hernando commented that he clearly had exceptional talent. Sanid expressed concern for Yuri, but Hernando smiled confidently. When asked why, he gestured toward the ring. Yuri was standing there, stretching out of boredom without a trace of tension or concern. Hernando confidently said that his appearance alone was enough to reassure them. Here, we are introduced to the rank of Great Magician, one of the ranks awarded by the Tower of Magic, a rank awarded only to those who have mastered the magic of origin. One of its rare offshoots is Fate Revelation, which allows the user to see the future of the world. In this generation, Hernando is the only magician to have mastered this type of magic. In a flashback scene, he's sitting in a casino, stunned after losing a huge amount of money for the first time since gaining this ability. And to whom? Yes, masters, it's our hero Yuri. He wondered if it was just a coincidence, but he quickly ruled out that possibility. He knew he could see other people's movements, but what really puzzled him was that he couldn't see anything about Prince Yuri. Everything he saw in his recent visions was blurry and frightening. A young man with black hair and black eyes, wearing the royal family crest and a cold, emotionless gaze. This was undoubtedly the third prince. In that vision, Yuri was shown fighting valiantly, his body covered in blood before finally falling to the ground. It was then that Hernando realized that the story he had ignored was all about one thing: good manners. As he followed Yuri's recent movements and actions, he became convinced that he was not under the spell of fate, and that he was indeed a person without a destiny. In the dueling arena, Yuri called out to the Imperial Knight, asking if he would stop waving his sword in the air and start fighting. Prince George asked Yuri if he needed more time to prepare, but Yuri replied that he was ready. The knight replied that he, too, was ready. The king announced the start of the duel. The two opponents stood facing each other, each waiting for the right moment to strike the first blow. Yuri attacked without hesitation, and the knight was surprised by his speed, but responded with equal speed. They exchanged blows with vigor, sparks flying from the clash of their swords. Yuri received a powerful blow that knocked him back a little. The knight raised his sword high, ready to strike again. At that moment, the king quietly called out to Hernando, who approached him, waiting to hear what he had to say. The king asked him what he thought of the outcome of the duel. Hernando hesitated for a moment and then looked at the arena, where the duel was fierce. With a slight smile, he replied that he didn't know at the moment. The king reminded him that he had come to the kingdom of Prial guided by some kind of celestial sign. Hernando replied, yes. With tension evident on the faces of the soldiers present, the king asked if it was time to leave, but Hernando said no. Fiore said it was good to hear that he wasn't leaving anytime soon, and Hernando replied that the king was giving him an honor he didn't think he deserved, that he was just a lowly magician. The king warned him not to be too modest because it might bring misfortune, and then asked if that meant he didn't expect anything serious to happen. Hernando did not answer directly, but merely asked the king who he thought was the stronger of the two. Meanwhile, the Imperial Knight had begun a violent attack with a massive mana attack, his eyes seemingly intent on killing. The king calmly replied that Yuri's opponent was the stronger of the two. Hernando nodded, confirming that he shared the same opinion. He remembered the moment he arrived in Priol, when he felt that the signs of the sky had led him to this place. He thought that the person who could change the fate of the world was here, but at first, he hesitated, especially since the sword had not yet been drawn, and he thought there was no reason for him to stay. He explained to the king that he thought his time in Priol was over. At that moment, the knight launched a powerful attack, while Yuri stood still. Hernando said he realized that the time was not yet ripe. Yuri opened his eyes, brimming with confidence as he began to activate his mana sword, declaring that the time of trial was over, and then rushed towards his opponent with tremendous speed and said, "It's time to end the battle." The knight seemed surprised by Yuri's sudden speed. Yuri tightened his grip on the sword and swung with all his might. For the first time, the Imperial Knight felt real danger creep up on him, a sense of fear. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "I'm going to die." In the stands, Prince George and Princess Katerina were stunned, while the king just watched silently. Sanid was stunned, while Hernando smiled and someone shouted in disbelief that Yuri had activated the power of the sword at such a critical moment. On the battlefield, the Imperial Knight froze in shock, his sword shattered by Yuri's fatal blow. Hernando remembered the purpose of his coming to Priol and realized that he had been following the signs of the heavens, but had met someone who defied them. A smile appeared on Prince George's face. Hernando continued his meditation, life turned into death and death into life, and the fate of the present changed the moment the third prince activated his sword. He saw that every step Yuri took was a challenge to the will of heaven and that he had transcended the limits of heaven. In the arena, Yuri was smiling and excited as he heard the cheers of the crowd. Hernando continued to think to himself that Yuri Broyle had indeed transcended fate, and exclaimed, "He's amazing." He said he could no longer contain his excitement to see how far this young man would go. Yuri felt that this moment marked the true beginning of changing the fate of this world. 5 years later, Broyle's mansion was quiet. In one of its corridors, a new maid was moving at a nervous pace, absent-mindedly wondering how she had gotten lost and afraid of being caught. Suddenly, she was interrupted by a voice calling her. She was startled, and turned quickly to see a young man with black hair and a stern expression, who asked her if she was new to the palace. It didn't escape her notice that the color of his hair indicated that he belonged to the royal family. In a sharp tone, he asked her what she was doing here. She tried to reply, but her nervousness confused her. She reminded herself of the advice of the older servants but couldn't get the words out easily. The young man repeated his question in a stricter tone and she became even more confused. The king is known for being dull, and the crown prince is known for smiling a lot. But this young man was nothing like either of them. He asked her in an annoyed voice if she was deliberately ignoring him. Only then did she realize he was the third prince. She stammered as she tried to explain herself, claiming that she was on her way to a certain place, but the prince was not convinced and asked her if there were instructions among the servants not to talk to him, then explained that he would teach everyone a lesson today. Suddenly, amidst the tension, a quiet voice was heard, saying, "Brother." The maid knew a member of the royal family who was known to be calm and confident, so she had no trouble recognizing the person coming in with a confident stride, carrying a sword and looking dignified. The newcomer entered the hall and asked his brother in a sarcastic tone if he was bothering the maid again. That was the first prince, Cedric, now taller. Later, we see Yuri walking down a hallway in the palace, eating candy. During his walk, he meets his brother and the maid, and it turns out that the maid had given him the candy he was eating as a small token of her gratitude. Yuri thought the candy she gave him was really delicious. As he cleaned his hands, he said, "Sogyong of the Wounded Hand Kingdom." This person was using mana to minimize the pressure on his hand while holding a sword due to his increased control over mana. From this, Yuri knew that he had reached an advanced level. He recalled in his mind that 5 years had passed since his return to the past, and the moment when he had reawakened after being killed by Lauren was still vividly present in his memory. Standing in the garden, he realized that the peaceful days he had recently experienced were coming to an end. He looked at the palace and whispered to himself that everyone inside was now talking about him. Meanwhile, Yuri was knocking on the door of the meeting room, listening to the sound of someone shouting angrily from inside, chanting his displeasure at being ignored by those present. One of the guards was standing next to him and apologized, saying that the meeting was at its peak, and maybe they should knock again. But Yuri got so angry that he slammed the door with his fist. Everyone was surprised. Yuri entered the room, smiling, and explained that his previous knock had not been heard, so he had to knock louder. Yuri walked up to his father and asked to join the meeting. The king waved his approval and asked everyone to continue the discussion. A nobleman began to explain his region's situation, explaining that it had no reserve forces to support the alliance. But another nobleman objected and asked if he intended to ignore the empire's request. The former replied that there were other regions that could fulfill this request, which made his interlocutor even angrier and began to accuse him of irresponsibility. Yuri watched silently, knowing full well that everyone was calculating their own gains and losses, and that this had been an issue at this time in his previous life as well, when the Empire had requested military support for the Alliance army to counter the orc attacks. He remembered how the Alliance forces failed, causing great pressure on the borders of the participating countries by the orcs, except for the Empire, which was not affected at all, and he understood that what happened was nothing but a carefully planned conspiracy. Because of these events, the kingdom lost a large number of its elite knights, including the brave knight Leon Flandre. That's why Yuri was determined not to let the tragedy happen again. As the discussion in the hall escalated, a nobleman returned to emphasize that his region would not be sending troops, not even a single soldier. Before the debate could escalate further, Yuri intervened and announced that he would go himself, confirming his intention to join the coalition forces, asking everyone to prove their loyalty and devotion, adding that they should behave as befits the kingdom of Priel and not disgrace it. The king listened to his son's words and seemed thoughtful, beginning to understand his true motives. Later, Yuri arrived for his training, and while he was practicing, he heard a voice calling him from afar. He turned around and saw his brother, Cedric, running towards him with a worried look on his face. Cedric asked him if he really wanted to join the Alliance army, and Yuri replied that he did. Cedric tried to talk him out of it, pointing out that there was nothing forcing him to go down this path, as his status as a prince does not require require him to do so. Yuri smiled and explained that what he was doing was the duty of the royal family. After a moment of hesitation, Cedric announced that he was beginning to understand his brother's thinking and wished him well, pledging to protect the palace in his absence. Bernard was watching the scene from afar and was impressed by the strong bond between the two brothers. Yuri joked with Bernard and asked him if he was worried about him. Bernard replied that he doesn't worry too much because he knows that Yuri won't be harmed as long as he acts rationally. Yuri thanked him for his support, but Bernard urged him to be more careful, explaining that dealing with orcs will not be easy as they are both powerful and cunning. He referred to a special type of orc, known as pal orcs, who are characterized by carrying flags on their backs and are considered more fierce than others. Bernard advised him to be very wary of them. Bernard asked Yuri if he had a plan, but before he could respond, Aina entered the courtyard, calling out that a guest had brought something he had requested. Yuri smiled and said that he did indeed have a very special plan. In the guest room, Ellen's guild vice president, Germo, was waiting for him. Yuri walked in and greeted him and asked him where the lady was, to which he replied that she was still traveling and he had come on her behalf. Germo explained that Ellen insists on doing her own travels, despite his constant advice to take a break, but she always replies that she is simply doing what she does best. Yuri jokingly asked if that was the only reason he had come, to which Germo replied with a smile that he had brought him something he had asked for a while ago. Yuri opened the box in front of him and had a satisfied smile on his face, expressing his admiration for the quality of the work. To Yuri's delight, the box contained a special set of daggers known as the quadruple blade. Guillermo looked at the daggers cautiously and wondered if they were of real value as they looked more like ornaments than weapons, but Yuri assured him that they were very valuable, explaining that they were rare artifacts imbued with ancient magic. In a sudden moment, one of the daggers moved of its own accord and Germo panicked. Yuri calmly reassured him that he would not die, and Germo nervously asked him if he was controlling the dagger with mana, adding with surprise that he did not know that Yuri possessed such a degree of power. Yuri laughed and replied that he hadn't been wasting his time lately. Germo noticed the slight change in Yuri's expression and asked him if there was something on his mind, but Yuri said there was nothing important, then asked him to give his regards to Ellen and later send him a progress report on the opening of the guild's new branch in the empire. Guillermo agreed and left. Yuri lay down on the couch, and after a moment of silence said, "You can come out now." Asana stepped out from behind him, quietly, like one of Sungjin's shadows. Yuri asked her what had happened with Goryo, and she told him that she had delivered the warning as requested and said that she had left a threatening note next to his head while he slept. Yuri laughed and praised her for what she did, commenting that Goryo never stopped trying to steal Ellen's money. Asana then asked him if he really intended to join the allied forces as she had heard from the gossiping servants. He told her that he did. She asked him to be careful, and he smiled and said she was talking like he was going alone. She looked surprised and asked him what he meant, and he told her that she would be with him. She smiled and Yuri asked her if she really thought she could keep up with him. Asana then left the room and assured him that she would rather go anywhere with him than go back to where she was, and promised that she would be in touch soon. A few days passed, and the time came for Yuri to leave for the battlefield. Kingdom flags flew in the air, and Cedric called him and asked him to take care of himself. Yuri smiled and replied that he was invincible and promised that he would hold the honor of the kingdom of Priol high. Cedric smiled back, and Yuri joked with him, telling him not to study too hard and not to strain his eyes. Cedric laughed and said he would, then hugged him and said in a quiet voice, "I'll see you soon." He told him that he would return safely later. During the departure ceremony, the king announced the start of the ceremony. Yuri stood ready to receive instructions. The king calmly asked him if he was nervous, and he replied that he was not at all. The king then asked him to look behind him, and when he turned around, he saw a large crowd of assembled soldiers. The king told him that these were precious souls, and he had to protect them. Yuri felt sad inside because he knew that not all of them would come back alive. Yet he swore in his heart that he would do everything he could to make sure that history did not repeat itself. The king then asked him if he was confident that he could handle this responsibility. Yuri replied that he could, but the king interrupted him. In the next moment, Yuri suddenly felt a sharp killing intent directed at him. He immediately realized that he could not move, and that his body was no longer responding to him. He felt like death was approaching and realized that any attempt to retreat would mean the end of him. He hesitated, wondering if he could face what was in front of him, but quickly answered himself, "I can." In an instant, he detonated his magical energy and a bright blue aura erupted around him. He unleashed a powerful, energy-charged blow that collided with his opponent's power, creating a massive explosion and shockwave. As the smoke dissipated, he saw the king standing in front of him, smiling. Yuri was surprised to see him, and then the king spoke, "Don't be gone too long and come back alive." Yuri replied, "Yes, sir." Yuri then stood in front of the rows of soldiers and shouted loudly, "I am the third prince of the kingdom of Priol. I am the third prince of the kingdom of Priol, Yuri Priol. I invite everyone to put their trust in me." He raised his sword high and shouted the command to go, to which the soldiers responded with a strong voice, affirming their full support. Later, in the dark depths of the prison, creatures stood behind the bars, staring with glowing red eyes. Amidst the darkness, the old knight appeared and said, "It has been 5 years, and I will finally meet the third prince." Elsewhere, Yuri and his army were resting in the middle of an area. Yuri asked the knight Raymond how far they had traveled, and Raymond replied that they were about to reach Sedor. He told Yuri that they should hurry towards Sidor and then set off for Belshad. While they were talking, someone arrived and called out to Yuri, causing him to turn around and see a face he recognized from his previous life. It was Laurent, the one he had killed in that past life. Laurent looked perfectly fine in the present. Thoughts raced through Yuri's mind. According to the narration, Laurent is the eldest son of Count Francis, and his full name is Laurent Flandre. The latter walked right up to Yuri on his knees and expressed his pleasure to meet him. Yuri was surprised and asked him to stand up, but Laurent stated that there was something he had always wanted to say to him. When Yuri asked him what it was, Laurent replied with glowing eyes, confessing his admiration for him. Yuri was taken aback by this admiration, and Laurent went on to explain that ever since his father told him about the incident 5 years ago, Yuri had become his idol, knowing that the prince had risked his life to save his maid, raising his weapon and fighting everyone for her, which Laurent considered to be the true essence of chivalry. Yuri was silent after hearing these words, and then reached out his hand to help him get up, expressing his pleasure to meet him, especially after hearing about him from his father. Laurent insisted that he was the one who was honored to meet Yuri. As their conversation continued, Raymond approached Yuri to warn him that it was time to leave. Yuri agrees, but Raymond warns him that Count Sidor does not have a good reputation and advises him not to take things personally if he doesn't receive a warm welcome. The scene then shifted to Count Sidor's castle, where a huge banner at the gate read, "Third Prince, we welcome you all." Upon his arrival, Yuri expressed his amazement at the reception, and was greeted by Count Sidor himself, whose name was Haim Sidor, the Margrave of Sidor. Yuri dismounted and thanked the Count for his warm welcome, to which the latter replied that he admired the courage of the prince, who, despite his young age, had dared to go to the front lines, and then asked him if he had ever fought against the orcs. Yuri replied in the negative, explaining that he had only read about them. Our clumsy hero almost said yes. He went on to say that most of his soldiers also lacked first-hand experience, so he thought it best to study them first. The Count was impressed with his thinking and asked him if he would accept a gift from him. As soon as he said this, a guard approached the gate and opened it. In the presence of Yuri and Count Sidor, the Count signaled the prince to come that way. Yuri entered with his soldiers, and the gate closed behind them, making the soldiers nervous and anxious. Yuri looked at the Count, inquiring about the meaning of this behavior, and the latter calmly replied, "There is no need to be afraid." In front of Yuri, a series of cells appeared. Yuri looked around until he spotted the orcs. Count Sidor spoke up, explaining that they had managed to capture him after much effort and had collected every possible detail about him, from their little habits to their instincts. Yuri asked if this was the intended gift, to which the Count replied that it was, and asked, could there be a better gift than this? Yuri smiled as he thanked Haim, and then spoke to himself with emotion, emphasizing that this was beyond his expectations and calling the idea of torturing orcs insane. He turned his head back to where a soldier was standing and asked him his name. The soldier replied that his name was Simon Fish, the son of Baron Balf. Yuri asked what was going on in his mind at that moment, and Simon expressed his objection to what was happening, saying that what they were doing was out of line because locking an orc in a cell and then attacking it was unacceptable. Yuri listened quietly and then commented that this was his point of view. He then turned to Count Sidor and asked him to open the dungeon gate, to which the Count agreed without hesitation. Yuri turned back to Simon and reiterated his name, then ordered him to get ready, announcing that a real fight was about to begin and ordering him to face the orcs himself. In the next scene, Simon stood directly in front of the orc and was silently watching him. But suddenly, the orc started screaming with tremendous force. He proceeded to slam his head into the ground over and over again until the ground itself seemed to shake under his violence. Simon panicked and shouted that he couldn't fight this fight, saying that he couldn't fight a helpless captive. While his voice was still raised in refusal, the orc's hand reached out from behind and delivered a violent blow to his head. The blow was so hard that his comrades screamed in surprise and asked if he was okay, but the orc didn't stop there. He grabbed Simon in his arms so hard that one of the soldiers shouted for everyone to get ready to fight. At that moment, Count Sidor calmly intervened and told them to calm down and told them that they had already cut off most of the orc's limbs, then turned to Prince Yuri and said, "This is the orc." Simon was choking as the orc's huge hand clamped down hard on his neck. One of the soldiers shouted that they had to save him, but everyone was relieved to know that his tendons were almost completely severed and he would not die. The orc snarled as if trying to speak, and Yuri asked Haim if the orc was trying to take Simon hostage. Haim replied that he would summon an interpreter, and a figure covered in a strange black cloak quickly stepped forward, slowly revealing its face and ordering the translation. It was Cory. Yuri was surprised and mumbled his name, and the other confirmed that it was indeed him. Cory raised his hand to his ear and began to translate, saying that the orc was threatening to shatter every bone in the knight's body if the soldiers did not immediately lay down their weapons. With the orc still holding Simon's neck, Hernando stepped forward and began to recite his spells, and a stream of light emanated from his hand, then extended his palm towards the orc, forming a magical aura around him before giving the signal to advance. Yuri heard the command and sprinted off, paid tribute to Hernando, and rushed towards the orc. Yuri ran towards him and grabbed Simon, yanking him out of his grasp. As Simon was rescued, the orc exploded in a fit of rage. He hit the ground with his feet, his eyes reddened with a fiery glow, and let out a thunderous roar. They watched his savage expression and sensed that something was amiss. Yuri asked Haim if this was an ordinary orc. He replied in the negative, adding that although he was small in size, his fighting skill was exceptional, and explained that when they first caught him, he had devoured a knight by himself, and that this orc had taken many lives. Upon hearing this, one of the soldiers shouted angrily that he didn't care about being a prisoner and wanted to kill him himself, but Yuri rushed to calm him down, telling him to control himself, then explaining that he didn't stop him out of pity, but rather signaled him to look behind the orc. He drew his attention to the red eyes lurking in the darkness, and went on to say that they were all waiting for the right moment to attack. He added that the orc in front of them was nothing special and warned that the ones they would face on the plains would be even more terrifying. Yuri patted the soldier on the shoulder, reminding him that this is just a training exercise and a chance to learn how to kill orcs. The huge orc still stood before them, ready to pounce. The knights raised their aura-infused swords, ready to fight. The orc lunged forward with a torch to strike, but Hernando quickly raised a magical shield, forming a barrier that stopped the attack. The orc failed to reach Yuri and Haim, who remained watching. Raymond sprinted in and finished him off in one fell swoop. On the other side, another orc was attacking Simon, but he managed to block the attack, and suddenly, the orc spat blood as Simon plunged his sword into his body. Yuri applauded the blow and praised him, saying, "Well done." But the soldiers didn't just celebrate, their faces were heavy with doubt. Yuri asked them if they weren't happy, then looked at the dead orc's body on the ground and understood why. They had passed the test against an opponent who was unable to resist, and that didn't match their principles. But he added that this experience would increase their chances of survival in real battles, and told them to be grateful to Haim. Haim raised his hand, bowed slightly, and said, "You may have felt it went against the principles of chivalry, but orcs do not deserve the chivalry of knights." He then turned and continued walking, inviting them to follow him, adding that there was something else he wanted to show them, explaining that what they had just encountered was a simulation, and that what was happening inside the orc camps was even more horrible. After a short distance, they stopped in front of another cellar, and Haim turned to Yuri and said that what they were about to see was the result of those atrocities. Yuri's face became serious and he replied that he understood. One of the soldiers gasped in shock and asked, "What are we looking at?" It was half-orcs. Yuri furrowed his brow as he looked at them and said there were more of them than he had expected, and Haim confirmed this, explaining that they were not the type to show up easily. Simon stood up, disgust on his face. Haim explained that orcs capture humans and treat them like toys, and what they are seeing now is a product of that horrible pleasure. Yuri asked Haim directly if he hated orcs. Haim's gaze shifted, his voice became harsh and hateful, and he said that he hated them and would hate them until the last day of his life. Yuri watched him silently, touched his sword and thought to himself that Haim looked calm, as if he was used to this kind of horror, and recalled that every man has an enemy that he can never forgive. For him, the enemy was the Empire; for Haim, it was clearly the orcs. Yuri had heard that Haim had once found the body of his son in an orc village, and that image must still haunt him, just as Yuri could not erase the image of the destruction of his kingdom. Soon, the morning dawned and sunlight poured through the castle walls. Yuri stood, contemplating the view when a report came in. Haim walked in and next to him stood Cory. Haim said that Yuri should take Cory with him. Yuri recognized him and said that Cory was the same one he had seen in the basement yesterday, which Haim confirmed and introduced him by name. Yuri acknowledged that speaking the orc language was a valuable ability. Cory hesitantly stepped forward and said he had something important to say, but Yuri raised his hand, signaling him to stop, and said he already knew. Cory was surprised and confused by his words. Yuri handed Cory a glove and told him not to worry anymore, hoping that he would do his best from this moment on. Cory awkwardly grabbed the object and started to talk about its value, but Yuri interrupted him, calling for Mr. Raymond and asking him if the border area was in front of them. Raymond cautiously replied that it was, noting that there were a lot of bandits, but assuring him that there was no fear of an ambush. Yuri smiled and shook his head in disagreement, saying that bandits are just as dangerous as orcs and that they need to be exterminated. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, a group of people carrying supplies stopped. Suddenly, the sound of horses' hooves sounded closer. Something was approaching. Men appeared on horseback with malicious smiles on their faces. One of them, carrying a bloody sword, stood in front of the people, his features brutal and merciless. Then he raised his sword and began to brutally slaughter them, sending blood flying in every direction. Elsewhere, Yuri continued walking through the forest. Yuri turned back and looked at Cory, thinking about the trouble he would cause if the soldiers found out he was half-orc. But he reassured himself that entrusting Cory to Hernando was the right decision, believing that Hernando would be able to handle it. He remembered the confident look on Hernando's face, but admitted inwardly that the situation was still worrisome. Yuri pulled out a map and began to study it seriously, then waved his hand and called for Gerard. Gerard rushed over and Yuri explained that from now on, the reconnaissance mission would be his responsibility, and that he would have to go to a specific location and check it out in person. Upon hearing this, Gerard's face showed signs of concern. He hesitantly pointed out that the area is full of bandits and said that the mere presence of their unit is enough to make them flee, then wondered why Yuri is planning to chase them all. Yuri calmly replied that they should go after them anyway, adding that they were disrupting the activity of traders near the border. Then with a sly smile asked him if he lacked confidence in his ability. Gerard stood silent, weighed down by Yuri's words. Yuri went on to say that he can't rely on the other soldiers because everyone is nervous, and he himself is just a young prince without much experience. He recognized Gerard's genius with a sword but added, "If you can't even catch a bunch of thieves, what can we do?" No sooner had he finished speaking than Gerard jumped on his horse and said he would be back soon. Yuri smiled contentedly, saying that he knew Gerard could handle it, and that it was good to see him excited. Raymond approached, commenting that Yuri was treating Gerard well. Yuri asked if it seemed that way and then said that he simply enjoyed having Gerard around. He then turned to Raymond and asked if he could ask him a simple question that might seem boring. Raymond replied that he could ask him anything. So Yuri asked him why he was fighting. Raymond froze for a moment, having not been asked this question in a long time, and finally said in a reserved voice that he was fighting for Priol's safety. Yuri looked at him silently, then smiled and said, "That's a good answer." Impulsively, he ordered the others to continue marching, announcing that he was going to check on Gerard and sped off. The scene shifted to a clearing in the forest, where tents had been set up. A man tied up and lying on the ground was screaming at the top of his lungs, and another man approached him and ordered him to be quiet. Yuri appeared with a worried expression on his face and grabbed a knife, warning the man not to act rashly if he valued his life. At that moment, Gerard was watching through binoculars to report that they had found the thieves' hideout. Yuri complimented him on a job well done, then began questioning the captive. "Are you patrolling alone? Are there other people around? Did the commander really send you out on your own?" The man waved quickly, confirming that this was true. Yuri watched him for a moment and then narrowed his eyes when he spotted the glint of a necklace around the man's neck. He suddenly reached out and snatched the pendant, startling the man. Yuri held up the locket and asked him, "What is this? Does it belong to you?" The thief coldly replied that it didn't belong to him, explaining that the commander had ordered him to wear it while on patrol. Hearing this, Yuri prepared to draw his sword and asked if the necklace was some kind of magical device, but the man, horrified, insisted that he knew nothing. Yuri then coldly stood in front of him and said, "If so, I have no choice." Then he turned his face and laughed. "I'll arrest the commander and ask him directly." By this time, night had begun to fall. As Yuri watched quietly from behind a tree, Gerard called out to him to announce his arrival and then informed him that troops had been deployed along the robbers' escape routes, and that scouts had been sent out to assess their strength. Yuri smiled contentedly and asked if the rest of the unit would be able to handle it if he created chaos. Gerard replied in surprise, wondering what he meant. Without explaining, Yuri mounted his horse and signaled for action, saying, "If you're late, there will be no enemies left to fight." Gerard stood stunned, unable to comprehend what he had heard. Yuri galloped off, ordering the attack, while a stunned Gerard kept telling him to wait, warning him of the dangers of going alone. But Yuri continued to rush enthusiastically to lead the attack, his voice echoing with the neighing of the horses towards the thieves' hideout. Inside, the thieves heard the noise and exchanged puzzled glances, wondering what was going on. A man carrying food looked worried, but moments later Yuri rushed in with his sword on horseback, storming violently through the ranks of the bandits. They stood startled with surprise as Yuri confronted them with a wry smile, saying, "My fellow bandits, how are you?" It was dark by the time Gerard and the rest of the soldiers arrived, stunned by the situation before them. Yuri, sitting quietly over a captured bandit with a fire, greeted them, saying that they were late. Gerard rushed towards him anxiously, asking him not to act alone again, pointing out the danger of doing so. Yuri coldly replied, "If you don't want me to work alone, you'll have to keep up with me." He then asked Raymond about the fugitives. Raymond replied that they had eliminated them without any casualties. Yuri smiled happily as he grabbed a skewer of meat and suggested that they take the prisoners' meat and make dinner, announcing that they would be eating grilled skewers outdoors tonight. Gerard looked at the meat suspiciously and said it was still a bit raw. Yuri shook his head, smiling, saying that Gerard doesn't know how to enjoy food, adding that he has a lot to learn, and then announced that they would camp there tonight and resume their journey tomorrow. Meanwhile, the leader of the thieves woke up. Raymond stood up and pointed to their next destination. Yuri mentioned that they would head to Jadamel before reaching the Allied forces in Belshad, and added that they could meet armies from other countries in Jade because they all use the same roads. Yuri quickly asks which country he is heading to as he strikes a blow at the thief, and Raymond replies that it is the Holy Kingdom. Yuri then calmly commented that it was a country known for its holy magic. He added that if they become closer, they might help heal their soldiers later on. Raymond commented that friendliness is not guaranteed, then explained that he had heard that the leader of the coalition forces is the princess of the Holy Kingdom, yet there are rumors that she is losing the struggle for the throne and is desperately looking for achievements to strengthen her claim to it. He added that there is another rumor that she is willing to do anything with the coalition forces this time around. Yuri sat thinking for a moment, trying to remember the princess of the Holy Kingdom. Since he was concerned, Raymond suggested that he could look into her background more if he wanted, but Yuri merely smiled, downplaying the matter and saying that he would meet her face to face soon. The location of the Belshad coalition meeting required a stopover in Jade, an independent city tasked with supplying the army with supplies. Since it is under a separate authority, Jade enforced strict neutrality. Yuri warned the soldiers that any wrong move could be prosecuted under military law, then ordered Raymond to make sure that all soldiers, including the cavalry, understood that discipline was non-negotiable. Raymond immediately waved his approval. Troops were deployed outside the city with tight control. Yuri then announced that he would personally meet Mr. Jade at the palace. The governor greeted him with a smile, expressing his honor to meet the third prince of Briol. Yuri returned the greeting respectfully and thanked the governor on behalf of Priol for Jade's cooperation, but the governor said there was no need for thanks and assured that Jade would fully support the alliance. As they sat down, the governor praised Yuri's father for his battles against the orcs in his youth, and joked that the orcs must be trembling now that his son was here. Yuri laughed lightly and promised to try to live up to his expectations. A servant approached the ruler and whispered in his ear, at which point the ruler informed Yuri that the princess of the Holy Kingdom had just arrived and asked if he wished to meet her. Yuri immediately agreed. Moments later, Princess Sibylla entered the hall, accompanied by 2 knights. Her face was stern with no trace of warmth. The governor rose and greeted her. The princess cast a cold glance at Yuri and asked him if he was one of the governor's followers. Before he could reply, she coldly dismissed him, saying that she had matters to discuss with the ruler and asked him to leave. The governor was confused and tried to explain, but before he could continue, one of the princess's knights shouted at Yuri, calling him rude and asking how he could sit in front of the royal family without standing up. Yuri calmly and amusingly revealed his identity, saying, "I am the third prince of Briol." The hall fell silent, and the princess and her soldiers froze. The offended knights quickly bowed and apologized repeatedly, but Yuri jokingly laughed and said it was his fault for dressing like a vagabond rather than a prince, which only confused them more. Later, over tea, Yuri jokingly asked the governor if he really looked that miserable, to which the governor laughed and replied in the negative. Princess Sibylla apologized for the misunderstanding and begged him to let it go. Yuri joked with her again and then gave a formal greeting, introducing himself and offering his hand for a handshake. Sibylla shook his hand and responded courteously, then casually asked her how old she was. Sibylla was surprised but replied that she was 20. Yuri smiled and said that he was 18 and that the 2-year difference meant nothing, so they could skip the formalities. The governor laughed and said that building friendship before facing the orcs was a good thing. He asked Sibylla if she agreed and she hesitantly replied, "Fine." After the pleasantries were over, Yuri asked Sibylla about her troops and pointed out that he hadn't seen any soldiers on the way, and she confirmed that they would arrive on the second day. Yuri put his hand to his chin in contemplation and said he hoped nothing bad would happen to her. She replied sharply that order and discipline in the Holy Kingdom was not a concern, and then asked him if he thought something had happened. At this point he clarified that he meant external threats, not internal ones, and explained that orcs sometimes cross the border and set up ambushes without warning. The governor nodded in agreement, saying that orcs are smarter than their size suggests. Yuri ended the conversation by saying that he was confident that the Holy Kingdom would handle the matter, but advised Sibylla to remain vigilant. Later, while walking through the city, Yuri spoke with Hernando. When he asked him about the Holy Knights, Yuri replied that they were too stiff and old-fashioned, and the princess would suffer with them. Hernando asked him if he liked the princess, and Yuri just shrugged his shoulders and said, maybe. He then pulled out the necklace he had taken from the bandits, and asked Hernando if he was sure it came from this area. Hernando confirmed it, pointing out that only one place sells such things, and that's this market. Yuri asked if the bandit leader's claim about the necklace luring orcs was true. Hernando replied that the bandit leader said that orcs go crazy when they sense its aura as if it were war medicine, adding that it may be a magical effect, but it is too primitive to be effective. While they were arguing, the shopkeeper seemed fed up with them and yelled at them to leave if they didn't want to buy. They left and he said, maybe the bandits have bought the entire stock. Yuri smiled and said it was unfortunate. Suddenly, Hernando spotted something and called Yuri to attention, and they saw soldiers from Priol entering a building that looked like a gambling den. Hernando commented that gambling was taking place there. Yuri's eyes lit up with excitement, and he said he couldn't ignore it if his men were gambling. As they approached the bar, Yuri commented that discipline was necessary, and Hernando agreed. Elsewhere in the city, a knight from the Holy Kingdom named Finnick, deputy commander of Princess Sibylla's forces, asked if she had met Lord, to which she replied, yes. Finnick taunted Yuri, saying that he had heard a rumor that the Prince of Breal's prestige was at an all-time low, and that he couldn't believe that such an eccentric person was in command, adding that the glory of the Knights of Breal was long gone. Sibylla warned him not to insult Priol, but he ignored her, mocking Yuri's clothes and behavior. She looked at him disapprovingly, but he continued his provocations, saying that it would not be surprising if Priol lost a prince after the first danger they faced. Sibylla finally ordered him to stop, to which he responded sarcastically, as you wish, your highness. She then asked him if there were any issues with the main force, to which he smugly replied that everything was under control before leaving, explaining that they would be patrolling the city. Sibylla sighed anxiously. That night, the city's inn was bustling with noise and drink. Finnick and his knights entered with grim faces, and with disdain, he wondered who these patrons were. One of the knights replied that they looked like Priol's soldiers. Finnick scoffed at their lack of discipline, wondering how they were allowed in. Another knight laughed, saying that their commander's behavior clearly explained why. Finnick declared that he would not tolerate this spectacle. He raised his voice, wondering what the soldiers were doing here and if they thought they were on vacation. As they turned around with cards in their hands, his boring speech that no one wanted to hear reached his ears until he felt a hand on his shoulder. He suddenly turned around and froze. It was our hero Yuri, with a smile, and his hand still on Finnick's shoulder. He asked him for his name, and Finnick's expression changed, and he slapped Yuri's hand away, saying that such insulting behavior was an insult to him and the reputation of his soldiers. The soldiers looked stunned as Finnick continued to mock them, saying they didn't deserve to be on the battlefield, holding on to playing cards like children. Yuri's smile faded and was replaced by a cold stare, demanding to know the reason for this disrespectful behavior instead of answering his simple question, then wondering if the Holy Kingdom had any respect for rank in its military system at all. Finnick tried to remedy the situation, but before he could say a word, the door slammed open and Princess Sibylla entered, asking what was going on. As soon as she saw Finnick, she furrowed her eyebrows, reminding him that he was supposed to be on patrol. Immediately, his condescending voice faded, and he apologized with a bow. But Sibylla ordered him to wait outside, and he obeyed. Pent up with anger, she turned to Yuri and apologized on Finnick's behalf. Yuri smiled and told her it was unnecessary, then added sarcastically, unless you yourself are the king, you cannot be expected to control all your subordinates. She instinctively put her hand on her sword and turned around, and before she left, she said she would return the favor another time. But as soon as she left, his face went black. Raymond's words echoed in his mind, but he shrugged his shoulders, muttering that it was none of his business, and rejoined the soldiers for another round. They greeted him with laughter and cheers, eager to play with their leader. Yuri laughed heartily, saying, "That's good morale." Outside, Finnick was standing cross-legged with his knights when the princess approached. He angrily asked her if she had already become friends with the third prince of Burial, and she interrupted him sharply, wondering if that was really the thing to mention now. Finnick exploded in anger at the prince's lack of manners, but before he could say more, a panicked voice pierced the air. Both he and the princess turned toward the source and saw a soldier approaching on a bloody horse. The soldier dismounted and fell to his knees, apologizing for his appearance before delivering the breaking news. The main force of the Holy Kingdom has been ambushed by orcs. The princess's face turned pale, but she held firm. She put on her armor and mounted her horse. Mr. Jade asked her anxiously if she intended to leave immediately. She waved an affirmative, but before she set off, he suggested that she ask for support from Priol's army, explaining that it was not a matter of pride but of minimizing the losses of the allied forces. Finnick exploded in anger again, saying that the Holy Kingdom did not need help, and that the affairs of the kingdom would be resolved by the kingdom itself. wondering if the Lord really believed that their knights would be defeated by the orcs. The Lord tried to calm the situation, but the princess calmly interrupted him, reassuring him that she appreciated his concern but would deal with the matter herself, then called her knights forward and they all galloped off. He followed them with his eyes, sighing happily, and one of his soldiers said, commenting on the stubbornness of the people of the Holy Kingdom. The Lord replied, especially Vice Commander Vinnick. Without delay, he ordered the soldier to head towards Prial's camp and ask for the third prince's help. The soldier saluted and quickly set off as fast as he could, for the Lord had ordered him to hurry as they had no time. At the camp, Yuri received the letter, and as soon as he read it, his face became worried. Raymond asked him what had happened, and Yuri said that the main forces of the Holy Kingdom had been attacked and that the Jade Lord was asking for their help. Raymond was surprised that the request came from Jade and not the kingdom itself, and Yuri coldly replied that someone was too stubborn to make the request himself, and then ordered Raymond to prepare to move. Yuri turned to the messenger and asked his name. The soldier gasped, "My name is Roy." Yuri then ordered him to head to the tavern near the Amulet Market and summon the Knights of Prial, emphasizing that the prince would only accept the first 10 to arrive. Roy nodded quickly and set off, kicking up dust behind him. Yuri placed the letter on the table and clapped his hands as he muttered with a sly smile, "Time for a night tour." That night, Yuri and his riders set off for the site. He jokingly turned to them, asking if they were still a little drunk, and the knights proudly raised their swords in the air. Yuri laughed again when he saw their enthusiasm, then looked at Gerard and joked that he looked miserable. Gerard muttered that he was fine, even though he didn't look it. Laurent galloped off on his glittering horse and called out to the prince, joking gently. Yuri smiled awkwardly, unsure of what to say in response to Laurent's admiration, then replied that he appreciated his loyalty as a knight under his wing. Inwardly, Yuri wondered when Laurent had become so devoted. It was a stark contrast to what he had known of him in his previous life, but he also recognized that he himself had changed. Laurent's face lit up and his eyes shone with thanks to the prince. As they advanced, Raymond called out that he had spotted something on the horizon. As they approached, they realized it was the Knights of the Holy Kingdom. Before they engaged them, Yuri addressed his knights, reminding them that this would be their first battle against the orcs, and announced that he would enter the battlefield first and be the last to leave. As he spoke, his body glowed with a pulsating blue aura of power. He surveyed his troops and ordered them. "Third Prince Yuri Broyle commands you all to remain unharmed." He gripped his horse's bridle tightly as he gave the order to charge. In moments, the battlefield was engulfed in chaos. The princess was cursing herself for being too reckless. She secretly admitted that she should have expected an ambush. Yuri's earlier warnings echoed in her mind, and she realized that ignoring them was a mistake she couldn't afford to make. Ahead, huge shadows appeared amidst the fog of battle, and as they approached, the shapes became clearer and clearer. Her knights were fighting fiercely, flanking each orc with several men. Relieved to see the banner of the Holy Kingdom still flying in the sky, she turned to Finnick and told him that she would head straight for the enemy commander to finish him off. Finnick received her order and then instructed the soldiers to enter formation and attack, and the Knights of Light surged forward. The princess tugged on her necklace, her voice trembling as she whispered a prayer, begging the ruler to give them strength. Her horse began to glow with white light, and she raised her sword and commanded a gallop. As they advanced, they passed a skull embedded in the ground and covered with a silk-like net. As they approached, the skull released a malignant purple aura, and suddenly, a magical circle lit up under their horses, and the ground collapsed beneath them. Before they could react, the knights fell one by one into the darkness. The princess realized that she had made the wrong choice again. As she fell, her thoughts drifted back to the past, to the moment when she first received her sacred powers as a child. She was surrounded by congratulations and voices of pride calling her amazing. Determined to prove her worth, she sought to learn the sword arts as well. But the day she broke her brother's sword blade, she realized she had made her biggest mistake. Her brother felt his right to the throne was threatened and sent her to the battlefield. He spoke of a divine will and that fighting there would cleanse her soul. But now she knows he was lying. She lay on her back, hurt and wounded, whispering that it was all a trick, and that he only wanted her dead. Around her, the wounded soldiers were trying to stand up, and she ordered them to concentrate. But when she stared at her armor and sword, she saw a sticky black liquid stuck to them. Her face went pale, it's oil. She looked up to see orcs surrounding them, one of them, holding a torch aloft. Her breath froze and her thoughts began to unravel. Fire ambush. What can I do now? How will I survive? Did I go through everything I went through just to meet my end, like this? Suddenly there was a sound in the distance. She opened her eyes to see an orc's head flying through the air, then the voice repeated mockingly, "Is it that hard to say, help me?" Yuri was standing at the top of the cliff. He asked her if she was okay, and then threw her a rope. She grabbed it and climbed out. As soon as she stood next to him, she looked at him, said she owed him and thanked him. I wonder what surprises the future holds for her. But before he could speak further, Vice Commander Vinnick stepped forward. His ego dissipated. He bowed before Yuri and formally addressed him. announcing that he saluted the third prince of the kingdom of Priol in the name of the Holy Kingdom, then offered a sincere apology for the previous incident in the tavern, adding that he would not forget this favor. Even the princess stared in amazement, wondering to herself, is Finnick really apologizing? Yuri looked at him quietly, and after a moment of silence, he nodded and accepted the apology, adding that if the kingdom of Priol ever needed help, he hoped that the Holy Kingdom would return the favor. Suddenly, a scream rang out in the neighborhood. Yuri quickly turned toward the sound and saw an orc blowing a horn. He tightened his grip on his sword, but noticed that the orcs were retreating. He wondered if they were fleeing, after failing to kill the Knights of Light. Without hesitation, he ordered his men to follow them and not let one of them escape, and the soldiers cheered and rushed forward. But as they fled, Yuri spotted something. An orc was carrying a distinctive banner. His eyes narrowed and he recognized it immediately. It was the orc leader, just as his teacher had told him. The princess called out to him, but he signaled her to stay behind him. The orc commander raised his bow, readied an arrow with dark magic flowing from it, and fired it. Yuri focused, and in one swift motion, he drew his sword and split the arrow in half in midair. He smirked and said, "Looks like the orc leader is mad at me. Looks like I have to take the bait." Then he tells the princess, "I'll be right back." The princess is shocked and says, "Yuri, you're not going to go alone, are you?" He doesn't answer her and attacks the orc leader with a sword. And he thinks to himself, 5 years ago, Bernard was telling me about soul severing. In the past, Master Bernard used to tell Yuri that in battle, there are a million variables such as ground and air. Many things that have no number. The key is to expand your ability to act through repeated training. But your highness, your soul severing, is different. In an instant, you understand everything that is happening around you. Spontaneously determine the most appropriate path, and turn this into a sword technique. When Yuri says he doesn't understand, he asks him to explain further. Master Bernard, when the time comes, you will understand on your own. Your body will move first in the right direction, so that you can eliminate the enemy in the most effective way. In the meantime, Yuri draws his sword and starts to fight the orcs, but they get too nervous and start attacking him, so he says to himself, I'm 1 against 3 orcs. It's too dangerous to face them like this. Even though it's been a long time since I've been on the battlefield, there's no way I'm going to let this opportunity pass me by. The most appropriate sword strike. He cuts down all the orcs in front of him with his sword and easily dispatches them all. Then he says to himself, my body isn't following my thoughts. Okay, now, I'll settle for that. Then he grabs the spear from the ground, raises it up, and calls out loudly, Orc fall. Orc leader. We see the orc leader is very nervous, but suddenly, our hero Yuri attacks him, but Orcval blocks the attack with the axes in his hand. Our hero looks at the battle between the soldiers and the orcs, and then says to himself, they've decided that any more losses are not worth it. Then he says out loud, laughing, may this be enough revenge for the arrow I just took. The princess comes running over and says, are you tired? Yuri says, no, I'm fine. Anyway, it's all over, right? Sibylla, how does it feel after your first victory with the allied forces? The princess says, thank you, it's all thanks to you. Then we see a soldier in front of his friends and he says, I'm telling you the same thing I'm telling you. Semua ran forward and snatched the torch that had been thrown into the pit. The rumor was that Prince Yuri had poor skills, and I thought he was just a gambler who paid for himself with gambling money. A soldier with yellow hair and good looks says that these rumors are all unfounded, and that he is sure that His Majesty's blood is flowing through Prince Yuri in the strongest way. That's not possible. Allow me to explain to you all. His Highness's achievements one by one. White River, this guy is drunk. Who gave him a drink? And there's an undercover girl who calls herself Prince Yuri. It's strange that he's just a member of the royal family, and his intuition. He can see through the assassination technique that I've been hiding all my life, and now he's walking alone on a battlefield. No matter what the mission is, he's always one step ahead, hours ahead of the game. The girl calls the innkeeper and says she's looking for someone. The innkeeper asks, who are you looking for? She says, one with dark brown hair, a sword at his side, and he knows how to use the sword with great skill. The innkeeper says, honestly, I can't think of anyone with those qualities. The girl says, he doesn't speak the language of the continent. He might have a strange accent. The innkeeper says, oh, now that you say that, I'm not sure if his hair is really brown, but I do remember one person who had a strange accent. He ordered a risotto and recommended not to spice it up. He thinks of a person and says, how can I get to Balashad? The girl thanks him for the information she got from him and wants to give him money. He laughs and says, I didn't say that to get a reward, but as long as you insist. Thank you, ma'am. The girl thinks to herself, Balchad. This is where the coalition forces are gathering. He looks like he's headed in the same direction as His Highness. I have to move. early to get around him, one of the 10 most powerful men on the continent, the swordsman from the east. After the battle in Jed, we moved on to the next place. But while we were on the railroad, we had to set up tents and plants at night. We were well prepared after learning from what happened before in the Holy Kingdom. It's clear that everyone is used to this work. I was worried if I had to start explaining from the basics. Raymond says, we've set up tents at night like this before. Now, their bodies know what to do on their own. Yuri says, Sir Raymond, this is all thanks to you. You did a great job. I'm going to look around, and I'll leave the management to you. Raymond says, of course, Your Majesty. Yuri stands up and says to himself, it's quiet with so many people around us. The chance of an attack at night may be greater than I expected. But to his surprise, 2 soldiers grab one of the orcs and torture him, and the soldier says, you little shit. Didn't I tell you to stay out of my sight? The second guard says, honestly, this orc must be a spy. He could be laughing at His Majesty for his spy job. The orc says, no, that's not true. How can I even do that? It's not right. They catch the guard and he takes off his gloves and says, what's not right? You probably stole that too. The orc says, I didn't steal anything. Give it back. The guard says, I have to destroy it immediately. Yuri walks in and says, what are you guys doing here? Leaving all the people working to set up the camp. The guard says, Your Majesty, I think this guy island. He says, Yuri, he doesn't look like that. Let me give it back to you in a nicer way. Gore from my face. The guards get scared and walk away, and our hero says to the orc, are you okay? The orc says, yes, thank you, Your Majesty. He says, Yuri, would you like to disturb them? The orc says, no, it's okay. Everyone likes nice things and dislikes ugly things. It's a natural consequence. And if you had helped me, I would have been comfortable by now. But that would have kept me further away from my dream. I want to live among people after being recognized by them. Yuri thinks to himself, it's a hard dream to fulfill. Now, he can go with the soldiers under the pretext of being an orc language interpreter. But as soon as the raid is over, then he pats him down and says, Yuri, you're with Hernando now, right? And he says, orc, yeah. He says, Yuri, learn some magic from him. You need special skills to live among people. You know that. At night in the camp, in a tent, Yuri says, where are the preparations for a night attack? One of the commanders says, all the supply warehouses have been covered with fireproof cloth to protect them from fire, and we have also deployed guards around the fences and camps. The second commander says, why do we have to go that far? You also distributed more troops than usual. He tells them, Yuri, we're in the land of the orcs after all, and it won't be strange if anything happens. There's a good chance they'll use a fire attack again like they did last time with the Holy Kingdom. But he doesn't even get to finish and the soldier enters, shouting, Your Majesty. Breaking news, the orcs have attacked. The commanders all move and run out of the tent and see that the orcs are closing in on the soldiers and attacking with fire. The royal magician Hernando says, the situation is worse than I imagined. He says, Yuri, I don't know what to say. They have gunpowder now. Hernando says, that's not gunpowder. That's mana magic gone awry. And Yuri says, honestly, that's pretty straightforward. I don't even know what to say. Hernando, what's our plan for this situation? Hernando says, they could be throwing bombs equipped with magic. In that case, we have to stop the kids who are throwing them. The soldier comes in and says, Sir, Raymond, split up and everyone grab a unit. Hernando says, in the meantime, I'm going to see who's behind this stunt. Yuri says, Hernando, where's the magic coming from? Hernando says, this way, and then I'm going to leave and come right back. Then we see Orcval, the leader of the orcs, coming with the rest of the orcs, and our hero is shocked, and Orcval starts to attack him, but our hero dodges his attacks, and then he says to himself, this orc is unusually strong, and his movements, this are not normal. He seems to have a lot of experience in fighting. I don't like it, but I have to get a little further away from him first. Orcval charges at him with great force, but our hero is able to dodge it, and then he stops Yuri and says to himself, honestly, I'll admit that you're on a whole other level than the others. But okay, come on, show us what you're made of. A fierce battle begins between the two of them, and our hero Yuri begins to dodge all of Orcval's attacks, but he attacks him again. Yuri thinks to himself, mana, I should have realized this when I first heard they could use magic. If an orc mage can use mana. So Yuri says to Hernando, are they now dealing with gunpowder? Hernando says, that's not gunpowder, that's twisted mana magic. Yuri says to himself, that means that orc warriors can also use mana magic. Yuri says, so you're one of the special forces, right? And Yuri does the soul-severing power. Then he grabs his sword and thrusts it into Orcval's neck, and then says to himself, this orc, concentrate your mana on his neck to minimize damage. Suddenly the orc grabs the sword, but our hero manages to cut off his hand. The orc then charges at him, but the orc manages to hit our hero in the neck. Our hero manages to break Orcval's weapon and suddenly, he raises the weapon up, lowers it, pierces Orcval's brain, finishes him off and stomps on his body. And then he is shocked, and says to himself that he is still alive. This is one of the elite. He might know more than the rest. It would be a waste of time to kill him right now. Then the soldiers come to check on our hero. He checks on the camp, and they say, we've taken out most of the enemies. Yuri says, all right, gather all the orcs in one place. And get this one as well. From now on, we'll start examining the orcs. We see Hernando and Yuri in the camp, and Hernando is treating Yuri. And he says, the shoulder is a part of the body that is easily injured. You have to constantly treat and protect it to prevent any injury. Yuri says, you know, he's still an orc. And then he doesn't talk much anymore. Hernando says, oh, so the orcs can beat you like that, right? After that, he removes his magic and says, we're done, thank God, there's nothing serious. He says, Yuri, it's okay. Now, but he doesn't finish and Hernando shushes him. And then he says, Smoke, 1 minute. And you, Guardian, bring this here. He's got a hard field commander's chair, and our hero can't believe his eyes. And he says, Hernando, a commander must always be imposing. Understand, one of our soldiers was a carpenter by chance, so we put him to work. And Yuri says, well, since you've already done it, I can't refuse it, and it's not monstrous at all. Now, I'm going to start interrogating the prisoners. Bring them before me one by one. After a while, we see that our hero is starting to eliminate one of the orcs and the rest are very scared. And then he says to one of them, you have one chance to answer correctly. Who ordered the night ambush? The orcs get nervous and start talking. Corey says to our hero, Smoke, the orc is saying. He says, Yuri, don't worry about it. I can see it's just an insult. He then approaches Jared's knight, grabs the orc, and burns him. Our hero gathers his strength in his sword, fires it at him, and then tells the rest of you, I will ask each of you only once, and depending on your response, I may consider sparing your life without torture. He calls out to Jared and tells him to put the orc down. One of the orcs interprets and says they don't know anything because they're all just soldiers, but they were ordered by the orc Vale. That's why they want to leave them alone and punish the orc Vale instead. Our hero laughs and says, this attack was ordered by Ochoa. I've never heard that name before. We know that Ochoa, the Orc King, is the reason this alliance was formed, and he is also the orc who killed many knights in Yuri's last life, no doubt. He must be removed from this war at all costs. Corey tells Yuri he's asking if you'll leave him alone if he answers honestly. Yuri says, I'll do it. Corey does, and then tells our hero, Your Majesty, the Orcval is asking for your oath. He says that breaking your oath and attacking your opponent is an act that will bring your honor to the ground. Yuri Payne says he's faced many humans before. It's strange that an orc who walks behind the force would say something like that. Okay, I'll swear. Your Majesty, said Jared, the knight. What will you do after you release him? Yuri says, no problem, Jared, calm down. Okay, so the attack was ordered by Ochoa. He says it was. More accurately, his tribal leader relayed the order after he got it from Ochoa and the Alliance forces. You know our route, Corey says. He says Ochoa has a way of getting information, but he doesn't know how. Jared says, wait, Your Majesty. That means that the orc named Ochoa somehow knew our route and ordered the ambush. Right, Yuri says, yes, and he probably did the same thing in the Holy Kingdom incident. Orc Vale, last question. Ochoa, what's his power? Corey says that even if there are dozens of Orcvals like him, they're no match for him. He guarantees that Ochoa is stronger and more ferocious than any being in the world. He says, yeah, it could be, but I think you need to keep in mind. The orcs say, you know, human beings are much fiercer and more cunning than you can imagine. He says, you want to strangle him. I was going to keep the department. Daylight, I see him inside, running towards me. The guards are all getting their guns ready, and the orc is charging at our hero. Jared gets his gun ready and says, what a waste. And you have the nerve to talk about honor. Unfortunately, you're not that honorable. And then our hero leaves them and walks away and lets them finish him off. We see a man named Germain, who is Priul's priest, treating our hero. And he says, please, it will all be over soon. Priest, please stay here too. Germain says, yes, I'm coming right now. Hernando says, priest, take care of the patient over there first. I'm going to set the world to rights. Corey says, priest, I got some water. Germain says, it's a tough job. Corey, now get a little further back. Afterward, Germain thinks to himself, that was just plain water. But after the spell, I felt a strange aura coming from the water. Then he tells Corey to use the water to clean their wounds. It's holy water, it will clean their wounds. As Corey sat there using the water, he thought to himself, wow. As soon as the priest started using magic, people who were upset were quickly calmed down. A little while later, Hernando is sitting with Corey and Germain, and he says, things seem to have calmed down a little bit. Germain says, thank you for your help, Mr. Hernando. And Hernando says to Corey, you did a good job, Corey. Corey says, no, I didn't. I didn't do anything big. Pastor Germain says, it's good that the losses aren't more than that. Hernando says, well, that's before the real battle. The priest says, I'm sure there are worse things that will happen in the battle. God save us. He says, Hernando, I don't think it's going to be that bad. The priest Germain is very surprised. Hernando, he says, even though we're still recovering from a very serious battle, people are helping each other, bending over each other's wounds and charming us. He makes the sky look dazzling and says, I can't help but bring a little power to the hearts of these people. Mr. Hernando, please teach me magic, he says. What makes you suddenly want to learn magic? Cory says. His Highness suggested the idea to me, and, because magic makes people smile, I can do exactly the same. Hernando says, yeah, half an orc uses magic for people, right? That would be pretty cool. The next morning, the guard comes in and says, Yuri, your Highness. He says, Yuri, what's the matter with you? The guard says, the Knights of the Realm are visiting, and they say they want to meet you. Jared says, are you going to meet them? He says, Yuri, they must have come to meet me, since Balchad is already here. The captain of the kingdom's guards arrives and says, yes, it is an honor to meet your excellency, the third prince of the kingdom of Briel. I am the knight, son of the second Count Zenon, Rabio Artem. Your majesty. Welcome, said our hero. Did the empire reach Balchad before we did? Rabio says, yes, we are the vanguard knights. We have confirmed that there are orcs around Balchad, so we will pass on the information to all units in the area. He says, our hero, and the knight behind you, who island? The knight takes off his helmet and says, oh right, sorry I didn't greet you first. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position of honor right now. Our hero thinks to himself, so we meet again like this. A figure from my past that I'd rather forget. Graham Hartfall. And the knight is the knight of the empire. Graham Hartfall. And then he tells our hero, I, Graham, who has been stripped of his knighthood, pay my respects to the third prince of the kingdom of Briel. Then our hero says to himself, in my past life, I had to beg for mercy, to save my life. And then he says, Sir Graham, it's an honor. He says, Graham, please don't call me that. I'm not a knight anymore. Our hero says, if you say you lost your title, are you still fighting in this war without any title? Graham says yes, even though it's an embarrassing subject. Rabio says, Sir Graham, you didn't do anything wrong. You just fell into the wrong hands. I mean, am I wrong? There are no other knights as famous as you. Then Yuri thinks to himself, I heard that Graham lost his knighthood for some reason from the empire. I never thought I'd meet him like that in the Alliance. But a man who is more honorable than any knight I've ever known is now doubting himself and his knights. Then he says, well, I've heard a lot about you, Sir Graham, and it's an honor to meet you. He says, Graham, you don't have to flatter me so much. And he says, Yuri, I wanted to ask you, Sir Graham, how would you like to come to Bruel?